Hello. Namasarvebhyaha Suprabhatam. A very good morning to everyone who is assembled here and those who are watching online. A very hearty welcome to the 7th day of this series, Exemplars of Indian Wisdom from Karnataka. Today we have two speakers, one Shri Sandeep Balakrishna, who is going to speak on the historian B.A. Saletore, and then that is going to be followed by Shri B. and Shashi Kiran, who is going to talk about Dr. K Krishnamoorthy. So the first session will be by Shri Sandeep Balakrishna. We have already heard him speak about the socio-political writings of Dr. D.V. Gundappa. So today we'll hear him speak about Professor B.A. Saletore, a much forgotten historian, unfortunately. So I would welcome Shri Sandeep Balakrishna onto the dais.
Very good morning and a very warm welcome to all of you. Once again, I'd like to express my thanks to the Gokhale Institute of Public Affairs and Preksha Pratisthana for inviting me to speak on yet another exemplar of Indian wisdom from Karnataka, Bhaskar Anand Saletore. In Kannada, he used to sign his name as Bhaskara Ananda Saletturu. But he's widely known as Saletore, which is the village he was born in 1900. And Saletore is located near the Puttur Taluk in South Canara. So to begin with, we'll quickly examine some major milestones in his life and career. Saletore completed his early schooling in Mangalore, and then he moved to Madras and took a bachelor's in teaching. Then he returned to Mangalore and taught at a government school for about 3 years. After this, he enrolled for an MA degree at Bombay University in St. Xavier's College and quickly distinguished himself as a brilliant student. He majored in history under the direct tutelage of Father H.A. Heras, who encouraged him to pursue his higher studies. And so Saletore landed in England and enrolled for a PhD at the University of London. The famous British Orientalist of that time, he was also a scholar of ancient Indian history. He had learned Sanskrit and epigraphy. He was Lionel D. Barnett. He was his PhD guide. And till the very end, Saletore had a very high regard for Barnett, who in turn encouraged his diligent and bright student. The result was the publication of his seminal 2-volume treatise titled Social and Political Life in the Vijayanagara Empire in 2 volumes. This was published in 1931, and it was this thesis that got him the doctorate award from the University of London. But Saletore was not content with it, so he moved to Germany, where he received a second doctorate in political science from the University of Gießen in 1933, and he was also decorated as the Alexander von Humboldt I'm sorry, I don't know German, but Stiftung Scholar. So after his stint in Germany, he returned to Bombay in the same year, that is 1933, where he stayed for some years before formally starting his academic career as a professor of history at Parshuram Bhau College in Pune in 1938. He later moved to Lalbhai Dalpatrai College in Ahmedabad, affiliated to the Ahmedabad University, and in 1952, he was appointed as the chairman of the National Archives of India, and he retired from that position in 1957. Thereafter, he started his tenure as the founding president of the PG Department of Indian History and Culture, and finally as the director of the Kannada Research Institute at Karnataka University, Dharwad. Saletore unfortunately left this mortal world in 1963 at the relatively young age of 63 years. Now, the chief difficulty that confronts any person who is curious to learn more about Saletore's personality and several interesting and illuminative details of his career through anecdotes, writings about him is a sheer paucity of information. This is completely unlike other exemplars of Indian wisdom from Karnataka. We have heard from various people over these last 7 weeks. like M. Hiriyanna, Shrikanta Shastri, DVG, Dr. S.K. Ramchandra Rao, and other people, about whom we have a wealth of enriching, humorous, and educative anecdotes. I think a major reason why there is, such less information about Saletore, I think, and this is just my conjecture, is the fact that he spent most of his working life outside Karnataka, and he has not left behind an autobiography. So I think that's quite unfortunate. In this context, I must offer my profuse thanks to Dr. S.R. Ramaswamy, whose surprise postal deliveries have now become legendary. So, on several occasions, I have been pleasantly thrilled to find, some really obscure papers, all thanks to, lying on my desk, all thanks to those legendary postal deliveries. I also extend my gratitude to Shatabdani Dr. Ganesh, who has narrated several valuable aspects of Saletore's work, historical works to me. And from all that material, I could cull out some of the major milestones of Saletore's legacy. So in 1936, Saletore was invited to Hampi as a distinguished guest to participate in the 6th centenary celebrations of the founding of the Vijayanagara Empire. This was a distinction, that he had earned by the dint of his dedication and scholarship. But the backstory to this event is quite thrilling. So it all began 5 years earlier, that is in 1931. It was the same year, coincidentally, that Saletore got his PhD. So a gentleman called P.N. Bengeri, who was a scholar from Hubballi, he first mooted the idea of doing this Hampi celebration. So accordingly, an association was formed. It was called the Vijayanagara Empire Sexcentenary Association, and it was founded in Dharwad in 1933, and its aims were very ambitious. Over the next 3 years, leading up to the grand celebration at Hampi, the association would bring out various publications in different languages, all of which would highlight the multifaceted accomplishments of the Grand Hindu Empire. Simultaneously, it also conducted seminars and conferences and different cultural events in various parts of Karnataka and Maharashtra, extolling the best days of Vijayanagara Empire. The climax would be fittingly held at Hampi, the capital. The first conference was held at Hubballi in 1933 under the presidency of none other than DVG. The second conference was held at Raichur in 1934 under the presidency of M.S. Sirdar, and the third was held in Bombay in 1935 under the presidency of Bhaskar Anand Saletore. From December 25, 1936 onwards, a massive cultural and historical exhibition was held in Hampi, spread over several days. Some of the prominent attendees and well-wishers of this program included the Rani of Anegundi, K.P. Puttanna Chitti, the Raja of Savantavadi, C.P. Ramaswamy Iyer, C.Y. Chintamani, M.R. Jayakar, Pattabi Sita Ramaya, and Mirza Ismail. Its final culmination was the publication of the invaluable Vijayanagara Sexcentenary Commemoration Volume under the joint collaboration of that association and the Karnataka Historical Research Society, Dharwad. It is a majestic volume. I'm sure most of you have read it already, running to about 500 pages, and it still remains a collector's prize both for the scholar and the layman, containing a wealth of 32 essays. Its topics span, an extraordinary range about Vijayanagara Empire: art, sculpture, literature, music, dance, politics, war, society, economics, foreign relations, different aspects of Krishnadevaraya, and most importantly, suggestions for future scholarship related to Vijayanagara. Authors are drawn from a huge galaxy of stalwarts, including C. Hayavadana Rao, S. Krishnaswamy Iyengar, S. Shrikantaya, Raghavacharlu, G.H. Khare, G.S. Dikshit, M.H. Krishna, Dr. S. Shrikanta Shastri, Dr. V. Raghavan, and last but not the least, B.A. Saletore. The next milestone in Saletore's career was in 1953 when he represented India at the Congress of Archives held in The Hague. Then in 1957, he was appointed as the president of the Conference on Indian History held at Dharwad. This was also the year he became the founding president of the newly established Chair of Indian History in Indian history and culture at the University of Dharwad. His presidential address on that occasion still remains a masterclass in developing a proper and truthful perspective on Indian history, and we'll see a few details about that later. And then the other great legacy of Saletore was his distinctive eminence as a teacher. It is said that one of the hallmarks of a good teacher is his flair for making learning effortless, which reminds us of Ananda Kumaraswamy's memorable phrase, and I'll quote, "From the earliest times, Indians have thought of the learned man not as one who has read much, but as one who has been profoundly taught." And so were Saletore's students profoundly taught. Among others, two eminent names come to mind. The first is Dr. G.S. Dikshit, who continued and made precious contributions to Vijayanagara research. The second is the late Suryanath Kamath, perhaps the last iconic historians of Karnataka, who was chiseled in the mold of his guru. I'll read out a small excerpt from Srimati Jyotsna Kamath, who was another direct disciple of Saletore. "I had the unique privilege of being his student in MA. He was a wonderful orator, though not a teacher in the conventional way. His lectures would be full of anecdotes and scintillating humor, though not necessarily confined to the subject of study. He was in Germany when Hitler came to power, and he used to tell us how his teacher was the first to be jailed. Hitler's public meetings, which he attended, were dramatic and electrifying." So in that sense, Saletore is also a great historical person. Saletore laid great stress on the military and material strength that has to be developed by any country. He used to make passing references that India currently was not militarily strong, and for a weak nation, the ideology of democracy may spell disaster. Pat came the Chinese aggression in 1962, and we could see how prophetic our professor was, close quote. So the Chinese aggression also reminds me of an anecdote about Saletore that Dr. Ramaswamy once told in his inimitable narrative style. Throughout his working life, Saletore was a staunch and unafraid critic of Nawab Nehru and regularly warned his students about Nehru's serial blunders. I won't narrate the details, but this is the gist of it. So to sum up Dr. Ramaswamy's words, he went hammer and tongs against Nehru. ಅವನ ಹೆಣ ಹಾಕ್ತಾ ಇದ್ರು ರೆಗ್ಯುಲರ್ ಆಗಿ. Another lesser known fact about Saletore is that he edited the voluminous correspondence of the East India Company for the years from 1782 and 1785 as the head of National Archives. This was eventually published as a full volume titled Fort William, India House Correspondence, volume number 9, running up to about 1,000 pages. Now I'll read out a partial list of Saletore's works. Social and Political Life in the Vijayanagara Empire in 2 volumes, Ancient Karnataka, The History of Tuluva, Medieval Jainism with special reference to the Vijayanagara Empire, Karnataka's Transoceanic Contacts, Main Currents in the Ancient History of Gujarat, India's Diplomatic Relations with the East, India's Diplomatic Relations with the West, the Sthanikas and their historical importance, Vaishnavism in Vijayanagara, Ancient Indian political thought and institutions. These apart, he also substantially contributed long-form essays, articles, and monographs to various journals, which we'll see in a bit. Next, we can come to the background of Saletore's work. This also has an important bearing on how his legacy was shaped. But before that, it is essential to briefly describe the conditions of history research about India during that era. At its core, history research in India was one of the direct branches of the larger colonial tree of Europe's long-term effort to understand non-European cultures in order to maintain their dominance more effectively and for as long as was physically possible in the colonies. Apart from, actually, in fact, not apart from, but due to the imperialist and racial bias intrinsic to all such efforts, This phenomenon brought an entirely new perspective and approach to the study of India's past, speaking in a comprehensive sense. This perspective can only be called revolutionary in a way that was completely detrimental to how Indians, and specifically how Hindus, began to look at themselves and their past, including their own ancestors. To put all of this in a highly simplified fashion, this perspective was biblical, and its most disastrous consequence, as we all know, was the Aryan invasion theory. So every area of studying India's past was force-fitted into this supposedly infallible theory, which had acquired the status of an incontrovertible truth. But in reality, it was a global falsehood that eventually became a cult of falsehood. And we can cite one of the most egregious instances of how this falsehood was ruthlessly propagated and maintained with an iron grip. In 1922, John Marshall, who was the Director General of the Archaeological Survey of India, he learned of a discovery that forced him to make a decision which would either uphold the truth of history of ancient India, or it would threaten the hold of British on India. So what this discovery was, it was not his discovery, but two of his subordinates, R.D. Banerjee and D.R. Sahani, they sent him detailed field reports which would conclusively overturn the Aryan invasion theory. These were the discoveries of the now renowned Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, which predated the supposed arrival of Aryans into India by a few thousand years. So Marshall was stunned when he read these reports. What he did with them forms the next part of this story. So what he did was rather straightforward. He simply suppressed Banerjee's field reports for 8 long years, during which period Marshall did not sit quiet. He cooked up his own theories about Harappa and Mohenjo-daro so that they conformed, neatly fit into the Aryan invasion theory hoax. Not stopping with that, he published this hoax as a long-form article in the Illustrated London News, and he took credit for the discovery of these two ancient cities. No mention of Banerjee or any of his assistants. Finally, in 1930, he returned typed copies of Banerjee's original reports, typed copies of his reports. And when Banerjee, got them and began to, kind of read them, he found that all the photographs he had sent to Marshall originally were missing, and scores of crucial reports, his original submission, were all missing. And even worse, John Marshall did not return Banerjee's original reports and photographs despite repeated requests. But the story does not end here. With that, overnight, Banerjee's career was destroyed and he was shunted out of archaeology. Decades after Banerjee's death, his publisher revealed the this horrible story. I'll just read out a small excerpt. R.D. Banerjee, the man who really discovered the antiquity of Mohenjo-daro and deserved credit for it, was gagged and silenced by Marshall through designs unbecoming of a genuine scholar. So Banerjee died a broken man, but anyway, the reason I recounted this episode at some length was to provide an idea of the kind of criminal constraints that our exemplars of Indian wisdom of that period were working under. If this could happen to R.D. Banerjee in a practical field like archaeology, where physical sites and discoveries were brazenly falsified and the crime was gotten away with, we can only imagine the kind of threats and an atmosphere of unsaid oppression that Indian scholars, especially working in the fields of history, could face. So if this can happen to a field like archaeology, anything can happen to historians. So Saletore also was no exception to this atmosphere, although he did not meet the same fate as Banerjee, luckily for us. But that does not mean that he was not in the red eye of the European academic community, and we'll give a couple of examples for that. Now, like all his contemporaries, Saletore was also a polyglot. He was proficient in Sanskrit, Kannada, Marathi, Konkani, Tulu, English, and German. He also mastered Gujarati during his stint in Gujarat, just so that he could write the volume on the history of ancient Gujarat. He learned classical Tamil and classical Telugu. He took tuitions only in order to study the inscriptions, grants, epigraphs, and other historical documents related to the Vijayanagara Empire. This is but a small sample of how he prepared for writing his magnum opus. The other distinction of Saletore was that he was the first Indian historian to conclusively demonstrate the value of using epigraphical sources as primary evidence for reconstructing and writing truthful histories of India. Now, this does not mean that scholars before him or his contemporaries did not use epigraphic sources, but there was a catch, which was again rooted in the biblical, racist, or Eurocentric view of Indian history. Now, here is a small sample of this Eurocentric view in action. There was a German Indologist and alleged scholar of ancient India. His name is Breloer. He was a great admirer of Kautilya and wrote a fat book on Kautilya, extolling him, painting him in a glorious light. But he was an admirer, or he admired Kautilya simply because he regarded Kautilya as the equivalent of Goebbels to Chancellor Hitler. I'm not kidding. So, therefore, he draws the following equation. Chancellor Hitler is equal to Chancellor Chandragupta Maurya. The German Nazi Empire is equal to the Pan-Indian Mauryan Empire. Prime Minister Kautilya is equal to whatever, Propaganda Minister Goebbels. He was regarded as a great scholar for writing this kind of stuff. So, anyway, you can read his book. Like other alleged Indologists and scholars of India of his time, Breloer conveniently disregarded everything in the Arthashastra and other literature related to Chanakya, which did not fit his pet thesis. And he was particularly contemptuous of our shasanas, inscriptions, and epigraphic records. He uses some really strong language to condemn any scholar who studied inscriptions. So we won't get into that. But what I'll read out is a delicious rebuttal to Breloer's untenable acrobatics regarding these inscriptions. This is written by B.K. Sarkar, and I quote, "One wonders as to why Breloer felt it necessary to fling a joke at the student of inscriptions. All inscriptions are not genuine or objective accounts of actual facts, but should one happen to hit upon an inscription that is not only authentic, but also contains an unembellished statement of events, etc., there is hardly any doubt that every document of Shastra literature would have to be appraised by reference to this touchstone of epigraphy. Under those circumstances, the Shastras must follow the inscriptions as an authority for positive history." So this was exactly Saletore's approach. And in fact, as I mentioned earlier, he was the first Indian historian who correctly pointed out the innate value and the historical truths hidden in epigraphic records. By doing this, he also courageously swam against the tide of history writing in India, which was faithfully imitating this Eurocentric model, which regarded epigraphy at best as an ancillary source that had no real evidentiary value. Apart from their biblical and racial bias, there was another fundamental and straightforward reason for rejecting our epigraphic sources. And although a good number of European scholars had learnt Indian languages to a high degree of proficiency, they could never truly understand the cultural and civilizational nuances that will naturally come to a person by birth, that is, only by living in that cultural atmosphere. This umbilical cord of cultural affinity is the mother that feeds the milk of culture from her breast. In the realm of Indian history, our inscriptions, grants, shasanas are these mothers. They tell us the real history because they are the surviving first-hand proofs of how our ancestors lived their present, which is a point directly related to K.M. Munshi's conception of history. And I quote, "To be a history in the true sense of the word, the work must be the story of the people inhabiting a country. It must be a record of their life from age to age, presented through the life and achievements of men whose exploits become the beacon lights of tradition. The history of Indians having a common culture flows as a running stream through time, urged forward by the momentum of values and ideas, and must be viewed as such. Without such an attempt, the past would have no message and the future no direction. So unless you don't read through inscriptions and epigraphic evidences, how will you know, for example, the brilliance or the nobility of, say, somebody like Vidyaranya Swami? These are the stories which are actually hidden in epigraphic evidence, and these are the exact elements that we notice most pronouncedly in Saletore's magnum opus on the Vijayanagara Empire, and we'll come to that in a bit. So overall, Saletore's approach to writing history, and which is also reflected in his work, was fivefold. He used, a vast sources of evidence from Puranas, legends, to primary epigraphical sources, accounts of foreign travelers, folk sources, and literature, that is, literary sources. His final output was an exquisite, illuminative, and exhaustive blend of all these five elements. And as we shall see, Saletore's work on Vijayanagara, it remains so exhaustive that everyone who wrote on Vijayanagara after him either supplemented his foundational work or proved him right in the light of newer discoveries. So above all, Saletore was a fierce patriot and an uncompromising upholder of the Sanatana culture. In fact, he sought to delineate and expound upon the flowering, development, glory, and the downfall of the Hindu civilization and culture using history as a vehicle, and his works are the best proof of the success of this method. An inextricable part of his cultural patriotism was his abiding love for the Kannada land, its people, customs, and he declared in so many words, and I quote, "The values and ideals that are sorely needed in contemporary India are to be found in the history and culture of the Kannada people." And he put this precept to practice by being one of the pioneers in throwing light on the culture, various aspects of Karnataka history throughout the ages. Now we'll come to a survey of his works, just a few of his acclaimed works. And we will begin with his final work, which is widely considered to be his masterpiece. He died a year after its publication. This is the magnificent volume, Ancient Indian Political Thoughts and Institutions, and it runs to nearly 800 pages. This work is a comparative study of the great Indian political minds and the institutions they created throughout the ages from the ancient times. It is also a sign of poverty of our own time that this book, continues to languish in obscurity. In this work, Saletore for the first time makes an extraordinary comparative analysis of the four greatest political thinkers of all times: Manu, Kautilya, Hammurabi, and Aristotle. Introducing the scope of this work, Saletore writes, "The history of ancient Indian political thought is a story of great minds that evolved great political institutions and guided Hindu society for nearly 3 millenniums. Its significance lies also in the fact that it deals with a vast country which has had a civilization that goes back to at least 5,000 years, which has witnessed the rise and fall of many kingdoms and empires. Our study is marked by a continuity which is its next significant feature. Superficially, it might seem that later political thinkers merely reproduced the theories of earlier writers, but our ancients were too generous and tolerant to disarm legitimate criticism. It is this which explains why, in the purely speculative fields of religious thought, they had room for such agnostic thinkers like Brihaspati, whose school came to be called Charvaka or Lokayata. It would therefore be incorrect to say that the ancient theorists merely echoed one another On the other hand, they carefully maintained what their predecessors had said in regard to political thought. They recorded divergent opinions and thereby added to the totality and continuity of the subject. This conservatism of our ancient lawgivers, Dharmashastra writers from Manu onwards, was by itself one of the factors which enabled the subject of politics and statecraft to possess a continuity of its own. Herein lies a special feature of our study. The continuity of ancient Indian political thought makes it an intelligible field of inquiry. This is particularly noticeable when we take into account the genesis of ancient Indian political thought, the institutions which it brought into existence, and the factors which helped their growth when they received their final crystallization in the later age of Kautilya, after which they remained practically unchanged for centuries. From this point of, to the modernists, this study has a special appeal in the sense that some of the fundamental problems which were tackled by the ancient Indian theorists and statesmen have a striking resemblance to those which confront a modern state. Close quote. So this last line, the only senior contemporary of Saletore who elucidated the last point so profoundly and so extensively, so prolifically in both theory and practice was none other than DVG. He was the last link, perhaps, who could decipher our ancient Indian wisdom and set it in the context of the modern world, was DVG as an exemplar from Karnataka. And the fact that both Saletore and DVG hailed from Karnataka is an additional factor of pride for all of us. This is a truly majestic work. Its treatment is encyclopedic, judged by its content, organization, and attention to detail. By all standards, it deserves an independent and serious study in its own right, like a lecture series or a study circle. But for now, we'll take a brief look at its content, which is divided into 6 broad sections. I'll just read out the most important items so that we all can get a broad idea. The relationship between Dharmashastras and Dandaniti. When did Dandaniti secure an individuality of its own? The main schools of Indian political thought, the antiquity of some important concepts in Indian political thought, the social contract theory contrasted with the Indian situation, the Indian and the Babylonian concept of the state, Manu and the modern world, Kautilya and Aristotle, Indian political institutions, Vedic, Jaina, and Bauddha. The nature of the Indian state, anarchy and interregnum in Indian political history, law and order, the theory of the Prakrits, the Arthashastra and Niti Shastras, and finally, in a majestic discussion, Saletore gives a brilliant, exposition on what he calls the elements of the Indian state. This discussion alone takes up more than 100 pages. He dedicates substantial portions in the work for discussing Kautilya from various perspectives, and I'll list out a few of them. Manu and Kautilya, Kautilya and Aristotle, Kautilya and Ashoka, was Kautilya an idealist, Kautilya's institution of spice, post-Kautilyan schools, and so on. So in the end, it is very clear that Saletore held Kautilya very close to his heart, and I'll quote his own words. Kautilya, more than anyone else, epitomized in himself the fundamental ideas that were agitating the minds of our ancients in the most formative period of their history. Anyway, this work is in all respects and by any standard, it is invaluable, and it must be rescued from its current oblivion and popularized at all levels. Now, we'll come to the next work, and this is quite interesting. Now, when we look at the corpus of Saletore's work, it reveals his uncanny knack for selecting all kinds of random subjects and transforming them into full-blown works of original history. This work is a great example of this trademark Saletorean talent. It is titled Sthanikas and Their Historical Importance. It's not a full book, it is just a monograph of about 65 pages. It was first published in the Journal of the Bombay University in July 1938. Apart from its inestimable value as a historical work, it is also a thoroughly enjoyable read. The Sthanika was an office in the civil administration of Hindu empires in India since ancient times, and it got stabilized during Chanakya's time, and it lasted all the way up to the Mysore Vodayars. The Sthanika was a familiar term in Karnataka even as recent as the 1960s. Even in some parts of Tamil Nadu and Andhra Pradesh, people had the surname of Sthanika. Coastal, yes, exactly. How the so Saletore's monograph beautifully traces the journey of Sthanikas as an office over this extraordinary period of 3,000 years, and he shows its transformation over both space and time. He shows how the word Sthanika became synonymous with a varna or jati in some parts of India. He also takes apart many spurious interpretations on this topic made by both ignorant and politically motivated scholars and writers. But without getting into too many details of this work, in the limited time of this lecture, I will mention one singular quality of Saletore that reveals itself in this work in a very pronounced fashion. This is his deductive and inductive methods of arriving at historical truths about Sthanikas. To put this in a legal parlance, Saletore plays the roles of the defendant lawyer and the plaintiff lawyer, and also the role of a judge. He first poses a problem, then lists out all the opposing arguments before arriving at the final conclusion, all the way erecting difficulties and barriers for himself. This is something similar to Shatavdani Ganesh's Avadhanas, where he intentionally chooses difficult bandhas and erects difficulties for himself only to provide joy to the connoisseurs. So I will provide only one example of how the small monograph became highly influential. Now, how many of us really read university journals? In a country of 150 crore people, how many reads? I mean, from any time in recent history, nobody reads these university journals. So in this light, I'll tell you the story of a retired head clerk of the Postmaster's General Office in Bangalore. His name was I.K. Srinivasa Rao. This gentleman was so profoundly inspired by Saletore's monograph on Sthanikas that he wrote an entire book in Kannada on just one aspect of Sthanikas. Ganesh ಹೇಳಿದ್ರಲ್ಲ. The book is titled Sthanika Brahmanaru, Kannada Jillayalli Sthanika Padaviyallidda Smarta Brahmanara Aitihasika Parichaya. This was published in 1957. Its English translation, the Smarta Brahmanas of Kannada districts who occupied the position of Sthanikas. So the author expresses his profound gratitude to Saletore for first opening the eyes of the public to the Sthanikas, and in the end he says, and I quote, "The entire Sthanika community must be eternally indebted and grateful to the Mahaniya Dr. Saleturu, chairman of the ASI, Government of India." Saletore has also written a small but useful foreword to this work. Now the next work that we can examine quickly is his signal contribution to the history of Karnataka. This is a volume titled Ancient Karnataka, the History of Tuluva. So this was the first volume of a 5-volume comprehensive magnum opus for writing a comprehensive history of Karnataka that Saletore had planned, but death cut him short from completing that work. So we have only one volume. So this volume itself runs up to nearly 600 pages, and it is probably the most definitive, if not pioneering, work on Tuluva history written by a devoted son of the soil and its culture. Its inspiration was the primary source work in Kannada titled Tuluva Grama Paddhati. It was an ancient compendium detailing the life and times of the Tuluva Nadu. It was a primary source. Saletore first received it from the hands of a pontiff of some matha in Udupi. The work comprises an astonishing range of details, including village life, customs, tradition, village organization, duties of local officials, the system of land distribution, modes of punishment, setup of judiciary, and the historicity of prominent families in that region, such as the Hollas, Mayas, Ballalas, Karantas, and others. Like others, like in his volumes on Vijayanagara, the history of Tuluva draws from extensive primary sources, including but not limited to epigraphs, legends, oral histories, folklore, coins, and extant institutional practices which were preserved in these prominent families. Now, the chapters on the foreign relations of the Tuluva rulers, their prosperous merchants, their religious and family practices, the households of 32 villages of the Tuluva Nadu, these are all narrated in truly picturesque details. And in fact, I think this work is a fine model for learning how to write what are known as local histories. And with that, we come to the next work. This is also, a demonstration of Saletore's knack for picking unique subjects. This is titled Karnataka's Transoceanic Contacts. And its incredible contents include a high-level study of the Veera Banajiga community. And historically, this business community hailed from Karnataka, and for many centuries, they had contacts with Babylon and Assyria. And this work, this research on Veera Banajigas is also complemented in, there's a chapter in the Vijayanagara volumes which is dedicated to Veera Banajigas. And unfortunately, I was unable to find the entire book. I could manage to read only a few excerpts because I think it's out of print, and there are some reviews on that. But purely based on what I've read from these sources, I think we can arguably make a case that Saletore's work in this area is another good example of what is known as the Patha Pradarshaka method of history. The next work is a topic that is not only unique, but it is highly notable for Saletore's pioneering forays into Indian history. This work is titled Wild Tribes in Indian History, and it is truly one of its kind. Again, it is a slim work of less than 200 pages, out of which 60 pages are dedicated to notes and bibliography. But Saletore has packed this small space with a huge treasure of rich information in this often neglected area of Indian history. He draws from an extraordinary range of primary sources, again, Ramayana, Mahabharata, Puranas, native accounts, writings of foreign travelers, epigraphy, literature, both Hindu, Jain, and Buddhist. But more importantly, Wild Tribes in Indian History is one of the definitive works that proves that contrary to the modern vandalism of Indian history, Hindu kings always showed a lenient and warm policy towards the so-called wild tribes or Atavikas from the earliest period, and there was an atmosphere of mutual friendship and harmony between the Nagarikas or urban dwellers and the Atavikas. Saletore also demonstrates on the strength of these evidences that the so-called wild tribes were every bit Hindu in their culture, outlook, customs, and religious practices. The greatest example for this is the image of Puri Jagannath. Now, here is a brief list of tribes that Saletore provides. It's actually quite encyclopedic. I'm just listing a few of them. Kiratas, Shabaras, Bedas, Pulindas, Dasharnas, Matangas, Pundras, Lambakarnas, Oshtakarna, Karnapravarana, Ekapada, Kalamukha, Lohamukha, Yaksha, Kinnara, and Nishada. And he also gives an almost precise geographical details of where these tribes were located throughout history. It's a great work, actually. The other ancillary value of this short book is the fact that in a tangential fashion, it is yet another useful source to disprove the so-called Aryan invasion or migration theory. By itself, this work is a powerful rebuttal to the pseudo-scientific academic disciplines known as sociology and anthropology, which studies tribes with a laboratory or museum kind of approach. Saletore, on the other hand, correctly treats this subject using the prism of the indivisible or the Akhanda Sanatana cultural bond. In fact, we can offer a conjuncture that a fuller study of this book has enough potential to debunk many dangerous theories that have been spun about our northeastern brothers and sisters. And as we all know, such theories have had a disastrous impact on our national security itself. But anyway, so in this context, it's quite interesting to cite the warning that Saletore gives about having a foolish policy with regards to tribes. So he uses Krishnadevaraya's Amukta Malyada to make his point, and I quote from that. Minding the small faults of the forest chiefs who do not have extensive power is like trying to clean a mud wall by pouring water on it. If the king gets angry with them, he cannot destroy them utterly. But if he attaches to them by kind words and charity, they would be useful to him in invading foreign territories, defense, and capturing fortresses. And then Saletore gives his own verdict based on this line from Krishnadevaraya. The non-observance of these noble maxims of Krishnadevaraya the Great by his successors had a profound effect on the life of the powerful Hindu empire. This is verifiable from history. Now the next work is titled Medieval Jainism with special reference to the Vijayanagara Empire. In a way, this work is again special in the sense that Saletore studies Jainism from the non-religious standpoint, making a clear departure from typical Jain histories which mix up fantastic stories, myths, divinity, and fiction with facts like all those Shankara Digvijayas and the supposed conquests described in Sumadhva Vijaya and works of that sort. In his own words, Saletore declares that the scope of this work is to study Jainism in southern India from the perspective of kings, feudatories, nobles, priests, citizens, and women, and this is described with the aid of contemporary historical records, and he emphatically makes a very vital observation, and I quote, "The connecting link in the history of the pre-Vijayanagara and Vijayanagara Jainism was the great house of Vijayanagar." This point may sound rather simple and direct, but its real significance is still missed by historians of our own time, and the ungodly spirit of sectarianism and all kinds of force-fitting historical truths and biased history writing, it continues even today. Perhaps this is also the reason why truth seekers like Saletore are in such short supply. Now this work, Medieval Jainism, it's a great performance that shows a spirit of mutual harmony that existed between the Vijayanagara rulers and the Jain community in that empire. Saletore shows how royal benevolence towards Jainism elicited a similar response from the Jain community. The chapters titled Princely Patronage, The Jaina Men of Action, Women as Defenders of the Faith, Vijayanagara's Pledge, and Jaina celebrities in the Vijayanagara Empire are truly brilliant, and in many parts they are very moving. I'll read out just one small excerpt, which gives us flair of Saletore's writing. To the Hindu monarchs of the south, especially Karnataka, toleration was a vital principle and not a matter of political expediency. It was their most precious gift to humanity. In 1368, a dispute arose between the Jainas and Sri Vaishnavas. The Jainas of all the Nadus, including Anegondi, Hosapattana, Penugonda, and the city of Kalleha, which is Magadi, petitioned to Bukkaraya about the injustices done to them by the Sri Vaishnavas. The monarch, after due inquiry, took the hand of the Jainas and placing it in the hand of the Sri Vaishnavas of the 18 Nadus, including all the Acharyas of Srirangam, Tirumala, Kanchi, and Melukote, and those of the Satvikas, Moshtikas, Savantabovas, Holayas, Madigas, declared that there was no difference between the Vaishnava Darshana and the Jaina Darshana. So all those alleged historians who speak about, Hole Madigru, Nitara Madidru, Atara Madidru, Jaina Acharyuru, Matte ಶ್ರೀ ವೈಷ್ಣವ ಆಚಾರ್ಯರ ಕೈಯಲ್ಲಿ ಇವರು ಕೈ ಇಟ್ಟು ಪ್ರಮಾಣ ಮಾಡಿಸಿದ್ದು ಅಂತ ಕ್ಲಿಯರಾಗಿ ಗೊತ್ತಾಗುತ್ತೆ. Then Bukkaraya decreed as follows: if loss should be caused to the Jaina Darshana through the Sri Vaishnavas, the Vaishnavas will kindly deem it as loss caused to their own Darshana. The Sri Vaishnavas will kindly set up a Shasana to this effect in all the basadis in the kingdom. For as long as the sun and moon endure, the Vaishnava creed will continue to protect the Jaina Darshana. It's quite extraordinary, and this is a small sample, like I said. And Saletore was among the greatest votaries whose pen transformed the innate nobility and virtue of the Vijayanagara monarchs into a contemporary reality for us so far down in time. And his method was characteristic of other exemplars of his time. And in the foregoing passage, as we saw, he quotes directly from Bukkaraya's edict itself instead of relying on secondary sources and hearsay and that great devil of our time, interpretation. Now, in the tradition of keeping the best for the last, it is time to examine Saletore's seminal magnum opus, Social and Political Life in the Vijayanagara Empire, in 2 volumes. So to begin with, we can quote from the foreword to the book. It was written by the great scholar of history, Dr. S. Krishnaswamy Iyengar. The very extent of the subject and the vastness of details available would baffle anybody in this direction ordinarily. But Dr. Saletore has succeeded in producing a creditable work bearing on this vast subject. The work gives a correct and complete view of the life of the people under the empire during the 3 centuries of its fight to preserve Hindu institutions and Hindu civilization. So this is part of his foreword. This work still retains its preeminence as an eternal classic on the subject. To repeat, this was his doctoral thesis submitted to the University of London. But for both the academic and the common reader, its value is truly invaluable. It became an immediate classic, and it invited 2 things. One, it invited widespread acclaim and petty-minded criticism, both for the same reason, because it was such an extraordinary and path-breaking work. So, in an incredible feat of racist spite, the British academic F.J. Richards, he wrote an alleged review. I mean, it's incredible, okay? He wrote an alleged review of a 1,000-page masterpiece that runs exactly into half a page, just 4 paragraphs. This is a review of these 2 volumes. It is not a review, but it is a litany of cheap nitpicking, looking for things that don't exist in the work. Hage. So, social and political life in the Vijayanagara Empire is truly pioneering, and it belongs to the class of Jadunath Sarkar's volumes on Aurangzeb and the Mughal administration and his painstaking reconstruction from Persian primary records of the period. It belongs to the same class. And in a single stroke, Saletore's volumes created a huge and new tidal wave in writing the history of Vijayanagara, and it became a model for future scholars and researchers. It still remains na bhuto na bhavishyati, and for its intrinsic value, these 2 volumes are favorably comparable to P.V. Kane's volumes on the history of Dharma Shastra. In fact, the kind of preparations that Saletore made for writing this work is a beautiful and inspiring story by itself. So he spent a majority of his time at the India office in London, working very long hours every day, digging for every scrap of material that he could find on Vijayanagara. It is said that he could use only a fraction of this enormous wealth of Sanskrit, Kannada, Telugu, and Tamil monographs, manuscripts, epigraphs, numismatics, and all sorts of other evidence in his final published work. And his disciple, Srimati Jyotsna Kamath, she has written that Saletore's unpublished findings on Vijayanagara primary sources still have a great scope for further studies in this area. In fact, one fondly wishes that Saletore should have also written a detailed political history of Vijayanagara. So this subject remained very close to his heart till the very end of his life, and we get a small glimpse of his abiding interest. He says it in a tone of very humble tone. He writes, "I must confess that I have still not exhausted the subject." So this statement coming from an acknowledged expert on this subject serves as an important lesson of staying on the ground. And now we can quickly scan through some of the major features of social and political life in Vijayanagara Empire. He has dedicated this work to his guru, Lionel David Barnett, and its bibliography alone runs into 55 pages. And this is not counting the copious footnotes and long excerpts from various primary sources appearing in the main text itself. The work covers pretty much everything there is to the Vijayanagara Empire in exhaustive details, including the detailed story of its origin, the geography that it controlled, its revenue system, judiciary, administrative machinery, army, foreign relations, policy towards the Bahmani kingdom, social institutions, with a special discussion on Varnashrama Dharma and the central role that Brahmins played, social etiquette, valor, patriotism, houses, food, drink, dress, corporate life, festivals, games, and amusements. I don't think is left anything else. So in fact, from the level of details contained in the work, a creative person can actually physically reconstruct that era. Likewise, for people who are interested in preserving our cultural continuity, there is enough material to make highly informed links between that era and our own. And this is precisely where we can reconnect with the aforementioned point about epigraphy as a great primary source for writing authentic histories of India. Saletore's volumes on Vijayanagara became authoritative landmarks precisely because he spotted and dug out and narrated these real-life stories of real people contained in inscriptions and epigraphs and grants and royal decrees. But his real feat, his signal service, was to sift through literally thousands of such records to give them a proper chronology, to give them context, meaning, to flesh out the cultural nuances hidden in all of them, and to finally compile them into a cohesive and cogent narrative. I mean, you can't even imagine, his, it's not just a product of hard work, it's something beyond that. So, in fact, a whole world of connections opens before our eyes as if it is a physical world. Like, you're living in a physical world. This is the experience, at least I got when reading this book. But for Saletore's works on Vijayanagara, the wealth of these historical stories that he has unraveled for us would have perhaps been lost forever. Another great revelation in this work is that even as we read the pages, an almost uncountable elements of the Hindu civilizational and cultural continuity become evident to us. In the preface, Saletore describes the scope of this endeavor, and it is worth recounting from the Mula itself. First, he correctly characterizes the rulers of Vijayanagara Empire as the custodians of Sanatana Dharma. He is unambiguous throughout the book. And then he says, I applied myself to the elucidation of many an interesting problem connected with the private and public life of the Vijayanagara rulers and their subjects in all their manifold aspects. Vijayanagara rulers and their people may be judged in terms of the actions and thought of their predecessors both in and outside Karnataka. It is with this object that the following method has been adopted in the work. Classical and medieval Hindu theories relating to government and society have been given first, followed by Vijayanagara conceptions of the same. Further, the origin of the political and social institutions of the Vijayanagara princes and people has been traced to their Hoysala and Tamil antecedents in order to bring out more clearly the historical sequence that may be said to govern the actions of the Vijayanagara monarchs. An attempt has been made for the first time to bring before the reader the classical and medieval Hindu theory in harmony with Vijayanagara maxims and practice. Close quote. And these two majestic volumes are the living proofs of the success of his vision of writing this history. But on the note of value of epigraphic sources, we'll hear it straight from the horse's mouth, and I quote, "Evidence from all available sources have been utilized, and no source of information has been found so fruitful as the numerous epigraphical records which contain, especially in regard to government and social matters, innumerable details which throws a floodlight on the internal organization and the life in Vijayanagara." And in a direct challenge to the prevailing European notions of Indian history, Saletore gives us this gem: history is not preordained. Event Y will not automatically or naturally follow from event X. More often than not, great events of history occur through freak accidents of insignificance and end up having far-reaching consequences. Close quote. So Saletore correctly holds that the study of the manner in which Hindus of those times led their lives, it has a direct bearing on understanding how Hindus successfully warded off Islamic invasions in South India. Writing the history of Vijayanagara without this perspective and this understanding is fruitless at best and dangerous at worst, which has been the case today. And unlike the well-meaning but highly apologetic historians of today, Saletore was a fearless exponent of historical truths, however unpleasant they were. So he minces no words in criticizing the Hoysalas on a specific point. He writes that the Hoysala kings who made grants to pay off the jizya tax for pilgrims going to Kashi, and I quote from it, "This compulsory levy of this grant for raising money for jizya. So this compulsory levy only put off the danger for a worse day." And indeed, Hindus apparently learned nothing until their most sacred Kashi Vishwanath temple was destroyed by Aurangzeb. But anyway, that's a different story. And on the other side, Saletore writes with undisguised pride that the year 1346 CE witnessed South India rise out from a period of 68 years of struggle during which the intrepid hoofs of alien soldiers had defiled the pure Hindu country. No apology, straightforward. He says in so many words that the Vijayanagara Empire was, quote, "the visible embodiment of national resistance against Muslims." And he further says, the greatest heritage of the Vijayanagara monarchs was creating an atmosphere of goodwill and harmony in an era of political conquests and sectarian hostilities. After centuries of unremitting strife, it is only under the fledgling Vijayanagara power that all Hindus in the south presented a united front for the first time, including chieftains, governors, etc., who, instead of declaring independence, willingly united under a single banner. We can examine, several such more examples, but Saletore also poses one important question. Why was there no revolution against the new Vijayanagara rulers who actually replaced the Hoysala Empire? And he answers the question beautifully by giving enormous details of the bloodless transfer of political power from the Hoysalas to the Sangama brothers, and concludes as follows. The vanishing Hoysala rulers and the common people realized that the honor of their homes and women and the sanctity of their cows and the destiny of the country were safe in the hands of the descendants of Sangama, especially by understanding the ideals which the founders had placed before themselves. So this goes on, it's beautiful. ಮತ್ತೆ revise ಮಾಡಬಹುದು, ತುಂಬಾ ಚೆನ್ನಾಗಿದೆ ವರ್ಕು. So Saletore also marshals a wealth of evidence which shows how the Vijayanagara rulers maintained the continuity of the principles which had guided the affairs of the Tamil and Karnataka lands from the dawn of history till the 14th century when it was founded. And I quote, how all the Vijayanagara monarchs took extreme care with which before introducing any change, either in social or the political sphere. Cultural continuity, they were very, very obsessive about maintaining cultural continuity. So their officers would tour, the state and say, look, this is a new law, or this is a new revenue system, this is a new tax. Are you okay with it? Is this the thing that you've been following from the time of your ancestors? If they said no, the tax was not introduced. And you have, hundreds of pages that gives many of these examples. But perhaps the most central feature and contribution of Saletore's work on Vijayanagara Empire is this. He was the first scholar to conclusively prove that the Vijayanagara Empire was founded by Kannadigas. The whole section dealing with this point is a prodigious feat in which Saletore's scholarship slaughters a series of Western researchers, including Francis Buchanan, H.H. Wilson, Mark Wilkes, Robert Sewell, Vincent Smith, Walter Elliott, and Louis Rice, all of them attributed non-Kannada origins to the Vijayanagara Empire. Saletore's delicious evisceration of these Western worthies is in the same delightful tenor of P.V. Kane, who performs a similar surgery of, say, Jolly, Pargeter, Jacobi, Fleet, Keelhorn, among others. And he finishes this beautiful performance with words that once again resonate his enduring love, devotion, and attachment to the Kannada Desha and its people, and I quote, thus did Karnataka vindicate to the rest of the Hindu world her honor by sending forth a little band of 5 brothers who, far from being a stupid instrument for renovation and restoration of Hinduism, stood out Karnataka by birth, Karnataka in valor, as the champions of all that was worth preserving in Hindu religion and culture. Now, we can quickly examine a few more aspects of the attention to detail that Saletore gives in his work. In fact, his cultural sensibility, it shines excellently when he does a brilliant and minute analysis of Vijayanagara Empire's flowers, birds, rivers, water bodies, animals, all in the same Hindu tradition, he says, in line with the principles of the Hindu writers on polity. Then we have a whole section dedicated to horses and elephants, and apart from its details, it is very deeply moving in many places. He narrates the stories of some royal elephants, and tumba chanagide actually, kate tara odiskondu hogutte. But even more brilliant is the portions describing town planning, road networks, and so on. And his descriptions of major cities of the Vijayanagara Empire actually makes us want to visit them. And then there is something to be said about how Saletore devotes more than 60 pages to arrive at the founding of the city called Vijayanagara. The whole section is extraordinary, wealth of scholarship, and it brings a full range of his erudition that includes subjects like astronomy, historical dating, epigraphy, comparative histories, oral legends, and a sweeping knowledge of several languages, both in their old and new forms. And I think I'll stop at this point, but before taking leave of this work, here is the Saletore's assessment of the magnanimity and innate nobility of the rulers, both the rulers and the citizens of Vijayanagara. So this is what Saletore writes about the attitude of the citizens of Vijayanagara about paying taxes. Thus did the people color a purely governmental affairs, that is paying taxes, with the sanctity of a religious obligation. So I think chartered accountants would have been bankrupt in that time. So anyway, I'll conclude this discussion by giving a first-hand picture of the kind of hardships that Saletore had to face while researching this work. And here are his own words. the kind of work that has gone in for so many decades to reconstruct Vijayanagara history is only a painful testimony to the kind of devastation that occurred. Almost nothing sequential or historically logical material has survived. This is a piecemeal reconstruction using multiple sources, multiple perspectives, and is still subject to revision and newer discoveries. And yet, despite all this, Saletore was able to achieve this magnificent outcome. And it is a crying shame that even after 75 years of an alleged independence, had this Vijayanagara research work pioneered by exemplars like Saletore, if it had continued with the same pace, dedication, and passion, and the resources it demands, we should have already had a comprehensive, if not completed and truthful history of this glorious world empire. But anyway. And the next area of Saletore's legacy is his awesome contribution to various academic and other non-academic journals. And this was where Saletore was at his prolific best. And it is another area which reveals his multifaceted and, frequent contributions, even to specialist journals. And they are perhaps one of the best first-hand sources to understand both his range and prowess. He actually contributed hundreds of papers, and I can't list them all. But he has only a brief list of titles that help us understand his range. Folk songs of the Tuluvas, historical notices of the Lokayatas, the Tuluva Grama Paddhati, the ancient kingdom of Punnata, a Sumerian custom and its historic Indian parallels, some historical and quasi-historical incidents in Kautilya's Arthashastra, the Kanapatha Jogis in southern history, the identification of Satyaputta, rise of Vijayanagara, successors of the Shatavahanas in the eastern Deccan, the antiquity of Pandrapura, an unidentified embassy to the court of King Siddharaja of Gujarat, reminiscences of the Maukhari rule in Karnataka, a new Persian embassy to the Vijayanagara court, the value of Kannada sources for the history of the Marathas, the Bijapur, and the Mughal sultans. And here's a partial list of the kind of journals he wrote for: Journal of the Assam Research Society, Pune Orientalist, Indian Culture, Indian Antiquary, New Indian Antiquary, Indian Historical Quarterly, Karnataka Historical Review, Proceedings of the Indian History Congress, Journal of the University of Bombay. And Saletore was also an equally talented and prolific reviewer. And here are some of the books that he reviewed. Devudu Narasimha Shastri's pioneering work, Karnataka Samskriti, or review madidare. Karnatakada Veerakshatriyaru, successors of the Shatavahanas in the eastern Deccan, Kanmareyada Kannada Athava Kannadara Moolasthana, Maharashtrada Moola, a note on Chauthai and its meaning and legality. So we'll come to the next and perhaps the last section. I think it is fitting to end this session by examining Saletore's exposition on the study of Indian history, both as an academic discipline and as a sacred calling that he embraced. The following is an excerpt from his address when he was appointed as a founding president of the Department of Ancient Indian History and Culture at the Dharwad University. I would like to express my sincere thanks to Dr. S.R. Ramaswamy for unearthing this gem and for Shashi Kiran for WhatsApping it to me. Quote, I may observe that ancient Indian history denotes a vast and complicated field. Not only are the chronological limits of ancient India not clearly defined, but the contents comprising its study are not adequately described. With the discovery of the archaeological finds in the Indus Valley and elsewhere, and the immense literary, epigraphic, and numismatic evidence, and a wealth of indigenous sources in prominent Indian languages, the range and depth of the study of ancient Indian history have been so widened as to cause bewilderment to scholars. Close quote. The last line is perhaps the most significant, and indeed the only other exemplar from Karnataka who spotted, spoke, wrote, and predicted this phenomenon was none other than Dr. S. Shrikanta Shastri. Saletore was also among that rare breed of Indian scholars who foresaw the dangers of, and he did not mince his words, about the slow emergence of historical and cultural vandals like Romila Thapar and her gang. We are stunned when we recall that he spoke the following lines in 1957 in the same presidential address when this Marxist mafia in history was nowhere as powerful as they eventually became, and I quote, "But unfortunately, in this particular sphere of ancient Indian history, a good deal of loose talk by some persons has made the task of the historian onerous. In their view, ancient Indian history is supposed to refer to some insignificant personalities of the past." Close quote. And on the topic of Indian culture, Saletore is even more brutal. Ancient Indian culture is a coveted field which can only be covered by officials today. This novel concept, which devolves a self-imposed responsibility on political administrators, has not helped the cause of either history or culture. The frivolous and intemperate use of the word culture in our own days has only served to add confusion in regards to the contents of the subject. People have, for some reason, perverted the use of the term culture, and being on vantage ground, persist in their perversion, and what is even worse, hold up their views as models for the rest of the world to follow. It is time that the rational world cried a halt to their presumptuous perambulations in a province that falls outside the purview of outrageous officialdom. To single out one or two of the numerous components that make up culture and to pompously parade them as being culture itself without materially fostering the cause of the less attractive but more potent factors would be to put a premium on one's own powers of intellect. Close quote. But in a more telling manner, Saletore also brings home a very fundamental and a rather common truth that is evident to anyone who has even a rudimentary knowledge about our cultural history, and I quote, "No foreign element, however tyrannical it might have been, has ever succeeded in imposing its stamp on Indian culture without itself losing to a large extent its own relentless nature." This is the earliest and the most powerful rebuttal to the so-called hoax called Ganga Jamuni Tehzeeb and syncretic nonsense. So Saletore did not write voluminously like, say, P.V. Kane, but what he wrote became masterpieces, and they still serve as lampposts in the study of Indian history. It is a national crime that his works have remained forgotten and uncared for more than 3/4 of a century. Now there are serious historians, there are bookish historians, there are professional historians, there are mediocre historians, and to use P.V. Kane's memorable phrase, there are mere collectors also. So Bhaskar Anand Saletore belonged to that other rare category. He was a seriously talented historian. That talent repeatedly shows itself in most of his work, but it shines at its resplendent best in his Vijayanagara volumes and a monograph on Sthanikas. When we closely read these works, we understand what he was actually trying to do, and at this distance in time, how brilliantly he succeeded in doing it. It was a thorough cultural reconstruction of all aspects of the Hindu society, civilization, and culture by allowing the people and institutions of that era to tell their story in their own words. This is what he tried to do. So on this point alone, Saletore elevated himself from being an extraordinary scholar of history to the status of an exemplar of Indian wisdom from Karnataka. I once again express my heartfelt gratitude to Jeepa and Preksha for providing me this opportunity.
Our heartfelt gratitude to Sri Sandeep Balakrishna for that invigorating and thrilling lecture on the life and works of B.A. Saletore. Like an archaeologist, Sri Sandeep Balakrishna has unearthed the works of B.A. Saletore and he has contextualized it. He has also debunked gangs of alleged historians in his talks by quoting from Saletore. Thanks a lot, Sri Sandeep Balakrishna ji. May I request Sri Korgi Shankaranarayan Upadhyaya, sir, to come and hand over a token of our gratitude to Sandeep Balakrishna. We'll have a quick coffee and tea break and we'll assemble back for a lecture by Sri B.N. Shashi on Professor K. Krishnamoorthy.
भजो मधुर हरिनाम निरंतर भजो मधुर हरि
Welcome back, everyone. Those who are present here as live audience and also our online viewers. In the second session today, like already mentioned, Sri B.N. Shashi will be speaking about the life, personality, and the works of Professor K. Krishnamoorthy, a doyen of Indian aesthetics, particularly literary aesthetics and poetry. I invite Sri B.N. Shashi onto the stage to give his talk.
ॐ देवीं वाचमजनयन्त देवाः तां विश्वरूपाः पशवो वदन्ति सा नो मन्द्रेशमूर्जन्दुहाना धेनुर्वागस्मानुपसुष्टुतैतु सर्वेभ्यो नमः. As a student of Indian aesthetics and Sanskrit literature, I feel elated, humbled and gratified to give this talk on the life and works of Dr. K. Krishnamoorthy. I owe my understanding of all these subjects, Indian literature and aesthetics, entirely to Shatavadhani Dr. R. Ganesh. And Ganesh feels the same about Krishnamurthy. So I feel very gratified to be a small part of this great Vidya Vamsha. And I take this opportunity to offer my sincerest, heartfelt gratitude to these two extraordinary scholars whom I consider as veritable Vamsharshis. let me try to contextualize the contribution of Dr. K Krishnamoorthy to the study of Indian aesthetics. In modern times, two scholars majorly contributed to Indian literature and its analysis, that is called as Sahitya Shastra or Alankara Shastra. One is Professor M. Hiriyanna and the other is Dr. V. Raghavan. So these two scholars worked in different ways, but those ways were complementary to each other. Hiriyanna wrote very little. He was always succinct and to the point, whereas Dr. V. Raghavan wrote in an elaborate manner. We can bring to mind the introduction he wrote to a book called The Spiritual Heritage of Tyagaraja, and the introduction itself swallowed the whole book. He called it an introductory thesis. So that was Dr. V. Raghavan. Hiriyanna presented the unadulterated essence of the subject in an unalterable form. Whereas Raghavan was different. He ransacked all the sources related to the subject and traced the historical development of all its fundamental tenets, starting from Bharata's Natya Shastra all the way up to Jagannatha's Rasagangadhara, be it the Alankara Prasthana, the Guna, Riti, Marga, Dosha, Vakrokti, Rasa, Shaya, Paka, etc. Raghavan, Lakshana, Raghavan wrote about all of them. In fact, his contribution to the study of Bhoja Sringara Prakasha itself contains an library full worth of information about Alankara Shastra. To speak in terms of an example, to use a metaphor, because we are discussing Alankara Shastra, in our Shastra we give the equal status to example as that of a theory. To speak in terms of a metaphor, the river of Indian aesthetics in the modern times flows between two banks. One bank is Dr. V. Raghavan, the other bank is Professor M. Hiriyanna. And this is where Dr. K. Krishnamoorthy comes into the picture. He bridges these two banks. His works represent the ideal combination of depth and detail. He bridges at once these two banks of going to the primary sources, analyzing the fundamental concepts, and at the same time staying true and alive to the core essence of the subject. Krishnamoorthy authored more than 70 books in 3 languages, Sanskrit, Kannada and English, and he brought out monumental editions on seminal treatises such as Dhvanyaloka and Vakrokti Jivita, along with English translations. And he also translated almost all the major works of Sanskrit aesthetics into Kannada. And he was not just a first-rate researcher, but also a popular expositor. He contributed most prolifically to Kannada newspapers, the Kannada Vishwakosha or the Encyclopedia of Kannada, which was modeled after the Encyclopedia Britannica, and also to various magazines and also scholarly journals. So the number of book reviews, encyclopedia entries, popular essays and research articles that he wrote far exceed 1,000. And though he was well informed about various shastras, be it the Prachina Nyaya or Advaita Vedanta or even Vyakarana, he dedicated his entire life to the study, practice and dissemination of one subject, Alankara Shastra. He upheld the ancient saying, Ekasmin Janmani Ekam Shastram. Krishnamoorthy was born on the 30th of July 1923 in a small town on the banks of the river Kaveri in Karnataka, that is Keralapura. He hailed from a traditional Sanketi Brahmana family. His parents were N. Venkata Subbaya and Gauramma. Venkata Subbaya was a school teacher and he had a good understanding of Sanskrit and Kannada. It seems that he had passed the Kannada Pandita Parikshe but had not got the title or the certificate because of some technical detail or some technical issue. But he did not take up the exam again, but wished to see his son Krishnamoorthy grow up to be a scholar or a Pandita. And to this end, to fulfill his desire of seeing his son to grow up to be a Pandita, he taught Krishnamoorthy the rudiments of grammar and made him learn by heart texts such as Ashtadhyayi, the Amarakosha and Shabda Manjari at an early age. Later, when Krishnamoorthy himself took up the Pandita Parikshe, his father made him memorize foundational texts of Kannada such as Shabdanusashana and Shabdamani Darpana. So Krishnamurthy could quote from any of these texts at any given point in time from his memory. So this was one exceptional feature of almost all our yesteryear scholars. Thus, Venkata Subbaiah laid a strong foundation for his son's scholarly pursuits. Krishnamurthy did not get any great ancestral wealth. He did not bequeath any great material wealth, but Venkata Subbaiah passed on to his son certain virtues and values that were imperishable: meticulousness, perseverance, and a sharp sense of self-worth. And this last issue, the last virtue, a sharp sense of self-worth, I must say, is a distinctive characteristic feature of the Sanketi people in Karnataka. Krishnamurthy passed the lower secondary examination in Arkalgud in Hassan, and he moved to Mysore to get enrolled in a high school which was started by a Dharmamurthy, Banumaya High School. And life in this place proved to be very challenging for him, because all these years loving parents used to take care of all his needs. He was used to delicious dishes prepared by his mother, but now suddenly in an unknown place, Mysore, he was left to fend for himself. Because he was poor and could not afford food, he had to take meals in the houses of friends, acquaintances, and sometimes even in the house of considerate strangers. He used to take turns in visiting various people who were kind enough to have him over on some days of the week. And this practice was called as Varanna in those days, and almost all scholars, all our noted luminaries of Indian wisdom of yesteryears had to pass through this ordeal, including the likes of Dr. S.L. Bhairappa. And in order to escape from the mental turmoil caused by such abject poverty, Krishnamurthy immersed himself in studies, and quite naturally he passed the SSLC examination with flying colors. At the intermediate level, he studied various subjects: Kannada, English, logic, and even history. He chose Sanskrit as the optional subject, not because of choice, but because it fetched him a scholarship. Thus, Krishnamurthy's entry into Sanskrit was a fortuitous affair forged by an acute financial condition. And this was the similar case with many other scholars from Karnataka. We can remember Mahamahopadhyaya Vidwan N. Ranganatha Sharma. In one of his interviews, he has himself recounted that he did not choose Sanskrit out of his personal choice and will, but because Sanskrit studies offered him a chance to study without paying any fees. Such was the financial conditions in those days. But the thing is, they did not repent for studying Sanskrit in later times. They made the most of the situation and they excelled in this chosen subject and Sanskrit. And they went on to become torchbearers of the subject. So that was the inherent greatness of all these scholars. And Krishnamurthy, though he had to choose Sanskrit not out of his will, but because of other conditions, non-academic, he studied with single-minded focus and stood first in the examination. This was a tradition with Krishnamurthy. We will see this later. And he was the only student that year to secure a first class in the entire Mysore state. Moving forward in the BA Honours course, he wished to study English again, but actually chose Sanskrit to avail the fee waiver offered to Sanskrit students. The syllabus of this course was quite extensive and included the foundational texts of many branches of learning. As far as grammar was concerned, Bhattoji Dikshita's Siddhanta Kaumudi was the prescribed text. And Krishnamurthy found the lessons on this particular treatise hopelessly inadequate. The reason for this is perfunctory understanding did not satisfy him. And his father himself did not feel up to the mark to teach. So it so happened that Krishnamurthy went to his father and confided in him that the lessons on grammar in his college or school were not satisfactory. So what his father did, he took him to one Tippuru Subbaraya Shastri, who happened to be a neighbor and a relative. He was a traditional scholar. But there is an interesting detail here. He had studied grammar more than 3 or 4 or even 5 decades ago from Ramakrishna Shastri, who was the father of the renowned Kannada literature A.R. Krishna Shastri. And although he did not have anything to do with grammar for so many decades, he was confident that his guru's grace would not fail him. So he asked Krishnamurthy to come over from the very next day early in the morning and began his lessons. Over a few months, he managed to give a comprehensive overview of the Paninian system of grammar to Krishnamurthy. And in later years, Krishnamurthy would fondly remember the thorough instruction he received from Subbaraya Shastri, which was of immense help in his entire academic career. Krishnamurthy enrolled for post-graduation in Sanskrit and completed it in 1943. Obviously, he stood first even here. And it seems that the record he set was unheard of in the past 20 years and was not to be surpassed in the next 18 years. So for almost 4 decades, Krishnamurthy's record was unbroken. And despite this, Krishnamurthy did not get a job immediately after. And even here, in the face of such trying circumstances, he did not loiter his time away, but enrolled himself for the BT course and got the necessary academic qualification to be a teacher. And in the meantime, during his intermediate and undergraduate studies, he had appeared for the Kannada Pandita Parikshe, which we have already seen. And this also brings to us a facet of Krishnamurthy's personality that is really, that gives us a lesson that is worth learning. The exam included a paper on classical versification for 50 marks. So it is a matter of solace to us that scholars and teachers back in the day knew what to look for in a student of Sanskrit and Kannada. Because Venkata Subbaiah wanted his son to do well and excel, he took him to one traditional scholar, Ganjam Krishnappa, to learn the nuances of composing verses. On the first day, the teacher taught Krishnamurthy the building blocks of versification. At the end of a 3 or 4 hour class, Krishnamurthy had managed to compose a couple of verses in the renowned Kanda meter, Kanda Padya. He was extremely unhappy with this paltry outcome. On the way home, he thought for himself, our ancient poets would not have struggled in this manner to compose verses, huffing and puffing at every step. The secret of versification remains elusive. Let me try to discover it for myself. Then he came home, and after dinner that night, he locked himself up in a room and opened up the books of Pampa, Adipurana, Vikramarjuna, Vijaya, etc. and studied the poems very carefully, not to miss out a single detail. In a couple of hours, he had unlocked the mystery of the Kanda Padya. Its rhythm, the pattern of matras in it, the placement of the crucial jagana, etc. And he immediately composed 10 to 12 verses in the Kanda meter and showed them to his father. When we remember that Venkata Subbaiah wished to see Krishnamurthy emerge as a traditional Kannada Pandita, this incident brought immeasurable, unbound happiness to him. But despite his impressive academic educational record, Krishnamurthy fell victim to academic sabotage at the very beginning of his career. Like I said, he did not get a job in Mysore. Then A.R. Krishna Shastri came to his rescue. He wrote a letter to his friend Dr. S.C. Nandimat recommending Krishnamurthy's name for the lecturer's post in Basaveshwara College, which was only recently established in Bagalkot. Krishnamurthy joined the institution in 1944. He soon distinguished himself as a good teacher who would teach for hours on end without a break, and also as a first-class researcher. And now we come to the critical juncture of Krishnamurthy securing his PhD. In those days, scholars could independently secure a PhD from the Bombay University by submitting a thesis without actually having to undergo the regular coursework under a supervisor. K.R. Srinivas Iyengar, the well-known scholar and writer of English, happened to be an employee, a professor at Bagalkot at that time. He encouraged Krishnamurthy to apply for the PhD. And he also gave him the necessary confidence to write in English, because although Krishnamurthy had studied English in school and college, etc., he had never written academic papers in the language and formed arguments and so forth. So Krishnamurthy was inspired by K.R. Srinivas Iyengar to write in English. And Krishnamurthy so mastered the language that he became one of the foremost scholars who expounded Indian subjects in an alien language like English. He began to write on Anandavardhana's Dhvanyaloka. And alongside teaching students from 11 a.m. to 5 p.m. every day, he wrote or typed 10 pages and completed his magnificent thesis in just 2 months. And we can only imagine the kind of effort that he should have put in. There was no time to read new material, no time to make notes on various topics, classify them, discuss intricate issues with scholars, publish his own findings in journals, get perceptive feedback, rework the tricky portions, and so on. He had to depend on his own understanding and conviction. His thesis was titled The Dhvanyaloka and Its Critics. It extended to 470 pages. And this remarkable academic feat also brought with it a wonderful Upaphala, the first ever English translation of the entire Dhvanyaloka. And the story does not end here. The examiners of this thesis were Bharataratna Mahamahopadhyaya Pandurang Vamana Kane and Chandashastra Timingila H.D. Velankar, Haridamodar Velankar. Now these were phenomenal scholars whose very names were enough to scare the living daylights of namesake academicians. These literary titans gave their learned opinion that Bombay University could confer the PhD degree on Krishnamurthy without even the need to conduct a viva. The thesis included a critique of P.V. Kane's position on the authorship of the Dhvanyaloka. But even so, this did not stop the great scholar from commending the thesis. Such intellectual integrity ennobles the pursuit of academics, which is usually only a cerebral exercise. And Krishnamurthy was the first person in the entire Mysore state to secure a PhD in Sanskrit. This happened in 1947. And then after securing his PhD in the same year, he came back to Mysore to visit his parents. And then he had the greatest good fortune of receiving guidance from none other than Professor M. Hiriyanna. Krishnamurthy's father gave a copy of his PhD thesis to Hiriyanna and sought his invaluable feedback. This probably happened only a couple of years before the great scholar's demise, somewhere around 1948 or 1947. And despite his physical ailments, he read the thesis with great attention and sent for Krishnamurthy after 8 days. And we know from DVG's Jnapaka Chitrashale how Hiriyanna used to treat people, not just scholars, but also everyone who came to his home. So on the prescribed day of the meeting, it was somewhere around 8 in the morning, Hiriyanna was waiting for Krishnamurthy to come. He was standing at the very gate of his house and he welcomed him with great care and affection and seated Krishnamurthy on an armchair or an easy chair and himself sat on a stool. So this was the greatness of Hiriyanna. And by that time, he had carefully perused through the manuscript and had made notes also. He had a host of books open in front of him, Western authorities both and also Indian authorities. He asked searching questions. So there was no time for small talk, as was Hiriyanna's wont. He immediately began asking searching questions about Krishnamurthy's thesis. He quoted from Indian and Western aestheticians and explained to Krishnamurthy that the connoisseur is the locus of aesthetic experience. I shall come back to this crucial point at the end of my talk. Now, Krishnamurthy basked in the warm glow of Hiriyanna's carefully cultivated scholarship and unfailing insight into the subject. What are the sources to consult, how to collect and sift data, how to develop and present an argument. The master had answered all these questions without Krishnamurthy actually posing them. He advised him to not rush in the publication of his thesis. He asked him to devise his thesis subject-wise into several parts and send them out to academic journals for publication. He was of the firm opinion that later, after these writings were published in academic journals, publishers would themselves volunteer, come forward to bring them out as a book. And this brief interaction with Hiriyanna helped Krishnamurthy emerge as an exceptional scholar. In the same year, Bombay University revised its guidelines for academic designations. The institution in which Krishnamurthy worked also came under Bombay University, and accordingly, it demoted Krishnamurthy from a professor to a lecturer. So when Krishnamurthy actually joined the Basaveshwara College, he joined as a professor, his first job. And Krishnamurthy was obviously unhappy at this demotion. He resigned from the job at once and returned to Mysore. And to support his family, he translated Sanskrit plays such as the Nagananda, Ratnavali, etc. into English. It seems that he wrote under a pseudonym, Dr. Banerjee, for a publication label called Maruti Book Depot. And we have also heard, though there is no written documentation from it, people who knew Krishnamurthy firsthand have recounted this episode, that he also wrote textbooks or guides on Shakespearean's comedies and tragedies, Merchant of Venice, The Midsummer Night's Dream, etc. So, if Krishnamurthy, as a student of Sanskrit, as a teacher of Sanskrit, had to write guides and academic books on Shakespeare's plays, it obviously follows that he should have first studied them. When did he actually find the time to study these Shakespearean plays? We find it difficult to imagine. Later, he joined the Sharada Vilas College in 1949 and worked there until 1952. During this time, again at the behest of A.R. Krishna Shastri, he wrote an elaborate introduction to Anandavardhana's method of aesthetics and translated Dhvanyaloka into Kannada, entire text. In the introduction, he outlined the concepts of kindred subjects because Dhvanyaloka is written in an argumentative style, especially the third Udyota, that requires the understanding of various other philosophical schools, the Mimamsa, the Nyaya, etc. Sometimes even the Sankhya school, though not in a major proportion. So he explained all those kindred subjects that are essential to understand Dhvanyaloka. He summarized the contents of the text and explained them with apt examples chosen from Kannada poems. Because he translated the text into Kannada, he chose examples from Kannada poems, both ancient and modern. His examples range from the compositions of Pampa all the way down to G.S. Shivarudrappa, who was a contemporary. This essay is, even to this day, one of the finest expositions of Anandavardhana's contribution to Indian aesthetics. Krishnamurthy's maturity in handling the subject, broad sweep in choosing illustrative examples, perfect aesthetic taste in explaining those examples, and a prose style that is at once elegant and captivating, these qualities effectively hide the fact that this essay was his first attempt at writing in Kannada. His rendering of the Dhvanyaloka has set the gold standard for translation of Sanskrit treatises into any regional language of India. And we must remember A.R. Krishna Shastri's name with reverence at this juncture because he helped at every stage in the preparation and production of this monumental work. He not only inspired Krishnamurthy to take it up, but also corrected the proofs and moved heaven and earth to ensure that the work gets published in Prabuddha Karnataka, a journal that he had himself started a few decades ago. Krishnamurthy, it so happened, initially wrote only on Anandavardhana's aesthetic method and went to Krishna Shastri to get a foreword. And the latter thundered. He gave him a thorough bashing. I asked you to write a thesis and translate the treatise into Kannada. What you have done is you have written a foreword to Dhvani. How can I write a foreword to a foreword? But there was a background story to this. It so happened that the editors of Prabuddha Karnataka in those days, including Tasu Shamarao, he requested Krishnamurthy to write in a concise form because the editors had received flack from some vested interests that of late Prabuddha Karnataka is turning into Krishnamurthy's mouthpiece. Now, in those days, Krishnamurthy obviously was still a fledgling author and he had to comply with the norms and pronouncements of the editors. So what he had done was he had written just the foreword and he had corrected the proofs himself and excused himself from visiting Krishna Shastri's home for 4 or 5 months. And this episode that I just narrated happened at the end of it when Krishnamurthy went to his teacher to get a foreword. As soon as A.R. Krishna Shastri got to know this, he wasted no time and he in fact scolded and chided Krishnamurthy. Couldn't you not have come to me at an earlier stage? He went to the vice chancellor of the Mysore University, which was Kuempu in those days, his own student, and obtained his permission, not just oral permission, but written permission to publish the entire work in Prabuddha Karnataka. In later years, Krishnamurthy also published his brilliant translations of Bhamaha's Kavya Alankara and Mammata's Kavya Prakasha in the same journal. Kannada readers, all of us Kannadigas, should be eternally grateful to A.R. Krishna Shastri for his unstinted support to these works that are landmarks in the history of our language. Krishnamurthy, on his own part, offered Guru Dakshina by authoring an English monograph, a book on the life and works of A.R. Krishna Shastri. Subsequently, H.M. Shankar Narayana Rao published these translations from Sharada Mandira, his publication label. This marked the beginning of an abiding friendship that went beyond the transactional realm or relationship between author and publisher. Shankar Narayan Rao went on to publish several of Krishnamurthy's works, especially his Kannada renderings of the Sanskrit aesthetic classics. It is really a pleasure to read these well-produced works. And at this juncture, I must also spare a few minutes to talk about the contribution of various publication houses to the study of Indian knowledge systems. In the north and and in the south, everywhere in India, starting from the renowned Nirnaya Sagar place to the Bombay Sanskrit series, Trivandrum Sanskrit series, Kashi Sanskrit series, Darbhanga Sanskrit series, Kashmir Sanskrit series, Mysore Oriental series, a host of such publications, and even to this day, the Chaukamba Orientalia, Chaukamba Vidya Bhavan, etc., they have rendered yeoman service to the dissemination of classical Sanskrit texts. And if a learned and sensitive student takes this topic as for a PhD, he would be in for a great regard, for a great reward. And Krishnamurthy later joined the Canara College in Kumta in 1953 and worked there until 1959. Now, when Krishnamurthy joined the college, it so happened that it did not have a good library. So this prevented Krishnamurthy from taking up some serious research work. Now, in the face of such adverse circumstances, most other scholars would have launched a spate of complaints and fallen into inanition. But Krishnamurthy did not do any of that. He was different. He utilized the limited resources available and translated several Sanskrit plays into Kannada. So in order to work on translations, especially of plays, one need not have access to journals and learned articles, etc. Translations in those days required just the original and at the most the help of a dictionary. And for people like Krishnamurthy who had memorized entire dictionaries and texts, he was no need for any of them. So he utilized the resources, whatever was available to him in this manner. And the principal of the college, Mr. L.S. Kamath, was observing everything that Krishnamurthy did because he had only recently joined as a lecturer. And he was greatly impressed with Krishnamurthy's dedication to work. And to prove his appreciation, as a mark of his appreciation, he procured an entire library of well-curated Sanskrit books specifically for Krishnamurthy's use. This was the personal library of a great scholar, M.R. Telang, Mangesha Ramakrishna Telang. And Krishnamurthy obviously was hungering for it. He made the most of it. Armed with the massive knowledge gathered from a close study of an entire library of books, he wrote Samskrita Kavya, which is a masterly work on Sanskrit literature. He declared in the introduction to this work, now the confidence that he had gathered from this study equipped him to make this declaration. He says, I have not written about any work that I have not studied in the original. This speaks volumes about his commitment to scholarship. Samskrita Kavya is as much a scholar's favorite as it is a connoisseur's delight. It equips the readers with a keen aesthetic sensibility that is vital to appreciate any Sanskrit poem. It is dotted throughout with tasteful examples and introduces all the major genres of Sanskrit literature. And Krishnamurthy's observations on poets are always on the mark. Let me give you a couple of quick examples. Speaking of Bana style, Krishnamurthy says, so whenever we hear scholars, especially Western scholars, writing on Bana style or the Kadambari, Harsha Charita and so on, what we usually hear is that Bana puts us off by his elaborate descriptions. We get entangled in the maze of such descriptions and do not know where the story is taking us and so on. But see what Krishnamurthy says. Elaborate descriptions teeming with various figures of speech are a prominent part of Bana's wonderful work. If we remove them, the bare story that remains will appeal to children alone. We will then lose an extraordinary poet who competes with Kalidasa. So this is the negative effect of stripping Bana's Kadambari of all the descriptions. Next, he makes a similar, very poignant and pointed observation on Ananta Bhatta, the author of Champu Bharata. He followed Bhojadeva, who wrote the Champu Ramayana. Krishnamurthy says, Ananta Bhatta was not impressed with Bhoja's direct and appealing style. He took to an extravagant display of erudition. The invocatory verse of Champu Bharata betrays his love of artificial ideas, artificial compounds, and artificial rhymes. Unfortunately, later Champu writers found Ananta Bhatta's model and not Bhoja's worthy of emulation. Now, this observation is so far-reaching that it extends beyond the range of Sanskrit Champu works. It applies in equal measure to Kannada Champu works, Telugu Champu works, and almost all regional language literature, the Champu works in the regional language literature. Later, when the Karnataka University in Dharwad established a department of Sanskrit studies, the vice chancellor of the university, possibly D.C. Pavate, he invited Krishnamurthy to join as the professor. He enrolled in 1959 and stayed there until 1984. What is interesting is, in around 25 years that Krishnamurthy stayed at the university, he went on to guide 25 doctoral students. So one doctoral student per 1 year. He brought international fame to the university by his exceptional academic accomplishments. Under the publication tag of the university, he brought out critical editions of Dhvanyaloka and Vakrokti Jivita with English translations. He edited and published rare works such as Sayanacharya's Subhashita Sudhanidhi and Vadiraja's Yashodhara Charite, which is an epic poem. He translated this into English as well, and a collection of Anyapadesha verses, allegorical verses, titled Kavi Kaumudi, authored by Kalya Lakshmi Narasimha. And apart from this, he also authored a collection of critical articles on literature and aesthetics titled Essays in Sanskrit Criticism. In these years, somewhere during his stay in the Dharwad University, a calamity befell Krishnamurthy's family. His only son drowned in a river and met an untimely death in 1973. Krishnamurthy was shocked and shattered. And to overcome the depression caused by this heart-rending incident, he plunged into scholarly activities with even greater vigor. In 1984, he joined Satya Sai Institute of Higher Learning at Puttaparthi. This was after he retired from the Dharwad University. And in a brief span of a few years, 3 or 4 years, he again managed to guide 3 or 4 doctoral students. Subsequently, he moved to Mysore and lived there until he passed away on the 18th of July, 1997. Now to a few sidelights of Krishnamurthy's personality. He was extremely prompt in his scholarly commitments. If someone, say, wrote to him, asking a doubt or seeking some clarification, Krishnamurthy used to reply in the very next email, mail, not even email, which was unheard of in those days. Procrastination was unknown to him. He did not have a single good photograph of himself to print in the proceedings of seminars and conferences. Even after he had attained worldwide renown as an exceptional scholar of Indian aesthetics, there was no telephone in his house. He thought of cars as a luxury and traveled every day by bus, which was the most easily available mode of public transportation. It became so well known to the people in Kumta, Dharwad, etc., that they used to call the bus stop in front of his house as the Krishnamurthy stop. More often than not, he used to forget alighting at the right stop because he would be reading a book. The driver or conductor of the bus used to prompt him on such occasions, and he even had to walk back from afar on many days. And we should remember his wife, Srimati Sarojamma, who was a strong pillar of support to Krishnamurthy. She took care of their big family with 7 daughters, all by herself. Krishnamurthy obviously was always busy with his academic activities. He used to promptly give the month's salary to his wife and excuse himself from all household work. It was his wife who managed everything, from running the house to marrying off all the 7 daughters. And to top it all, she had to put up with her husband's irascible nature. Krishnamurthy was very fussy with food. He used to fling the plate with anger if, say, the idli was not soft or the chutney was too soft or the chutney was too sweet. Despite all this, Sarojamma treated Krishnamurthy and looked after him like a child. Many awards and honors came in search of Krishnamurthy. Chief among them are the Karnataka Sahitya Academy Award, the Karnataka Rajyotsava Award, Uttar Pradesh Sanskrit Academy Award, and the P.V. Kane Gold Medal from the Bombay Asiatic Society, and a certificate of honor for his contribution to Sanskrit language from the President of India, and most importantly, the General Presidentship of the All India Oriental Conference held at Rohtak in 1994. Now, let me give a brief introduction to his translations, which form a major part of his oeuvre. His English translations of Sanskrit works include Anandavardhana's Dhvanyaloka, an anonymous commentary on the first chapter of Lochana, and Kuntaka's Vakrokti Jivita, Vadiraja's Yashodhara Charita, and Kavi Kaumudi, like I have already mentioned. He even translated a few sections in a multi-volume series called Ancient Indian Literature. He contributed to the second volume published by the Sahitya Academy. His Kannada translations of Sanskrit classics include plays such as Bhasa's Pratima Nataka, Yagnaphala, Swapnavasavadatta, Duta Ghatotkacha, Karnabhara, Madhyama Vyayoga, etc., Kalidasa's Abhignana Shakuntala and Malavika Agnimitra, and also Mritshakatika, Uttara Ramacharita, and Ascharya Chudamani. And he also translated a few of poems into Kannada, such as Bharavi's Kirata Arjuniya. He translated the first 6 cantos, and also a unique work called as Mudra Rakshasa Kathasara, authored by Ravinartaka. And like I already said, his most signal contribution is his Kannada renderings of Alankara Shastra works into Kannada. Bhamaha's Kavya Alankara, Kavya Darsha, Kavya Alankara Sutra Vritti of Vamana, Dhvanyaloka obviously, Rajashekhara's Kavya Mimamsa, and Kshemendra's 2 great works, Auchitya Vichara Charcha and Kavikantha Bharana, and also Mammata's Kavya Prakasha. And among all these works, especially the Alankara Shastra works, the translations of Bhamaha, Anandavardhana, Mammata, and to some extent we can even consider Rajashekhara, are classics in their own right. What Krishnamurthy does and in these works, why are his works so unique and different from other works on the subject, is because of these reasons. He places these texts in their historical background, discusses ancillary concepts related to them, cites the opinion of several commentaries and commentators. In fact, on the Kavya Prakasha alone, he had studied as many as 15 commentaries, not just perfunctorily but very deeply. He draws profusely from the canons of Western criticism and also presents an up-to-date summary of the views of modern scholars on the subject. So if a person with a perceptive head and a sensitive heart carefully studies just the introduction and footnotes of these works, I have no doubt that he will go on to become a scholar of Indian aesthetics. Krishnamurthy also worked on several of English works and translated them into Kannada. For example, he translated James Hilton's English novel Lost Horizon as Lupta Diganta in Kannada. He translated one volume of P.V. Kane's monumental History of Dharma Shastra and one volume of Wintonitz's multi-volume series, A History of Indian Literature, and also Bankim Chandra's Bengali classic Sri Krishna Charitra into Kannada. And he contributed several introductions and articles. As far as history is concerned, he translated almost all the introductions that the great K. M. Munshi wrote to the far-famed history series, The History and Culture of the Indian People, published by the Bharatiya Vidya Bhavan, and also translated many articles in the Cultural Heritage of India, published by the Ramakrishna Mission. Now, be it translating from Sanskrit into Kannada or English, what Krishnamurthy does is he achieves a high degree of readability while staying close to the original. This is a remarkable achievement. One might achieve readability but sacrifice fidelity to the original. But if one chooses to toe the line of the original to a close degree, then his work will not be readable. Krishnamurthy does both. He adheres to the natural idiom of the language and does justice to the tone of the text, be it a play, a discursive essay, or a treatise on aesthetics. In Kannada, he translates verse as verse, mostly sticking to the metrical form of the original, and depending on the structure of the verse and the purpose of the translation, because even the translation can have many purposes. It might be a popular rendering or the rendering of an academic treatise which has to be perfect. So depending on these yardsticks, he chooses time-honored meters such as the Kandapadya or Vrittas, or adopts a modern matra measure. Let me give a few quick examples. To illustrate his English translation, I am quoting from his translation of Kuntaka's Vakrokti Jivita. There is an illustrative verse. Manini jana vilochana pata nushna bashpa kalushananu grinhan manda manda muditah prayayokham bhita bhita iva shita mayukha. This is a verse in the Swagata meter. Krishnamurthy translates this in this following manner. Slowly and softly the moon does rise, as if he were gripped with fear, exposed to the burning glances of damsels, bathed in hot and streaming tears. Now, to illustrate his Kannada translations, let us first have a look at his rendering of a verse from Shudraka's immortal play, the Mritchakatika. This is in the first act. This describes poverty or the various ill effects of poverty. दारिद्र्याध्रियमेति तत्परिगतः प्रभ्रश्यते तेजसो निस्तेजाः परिभूयते परिभवान् निर्वेदमापद्यते निर्विण्णः शुचमेति शोकविहतो बुद्ध्या परित्यज्यते निर्बुद्धिः क्षयमेत्यहो निधनता सर्वापदामास्पदम्. Because this is a play which is meant for popular reading, Krishnamurthy adopts a Panchamatra measure, which is very natural to Nadugannada and Hosagannada. Look at the way he translates. ದಾರಿದ್ರ್ಯದಿಂ ಲಜ್ಜೆಯಿಂ ಕಳೆಯಳಿವೋ ಕಳೆಯಳಿಯಲ ಅವಮಾನ ಬಿಡದೆಬಹುದು ಅವಮಾನದಿಂ ಖೇದದಿಂ ಕಟುಶೋಕಮಾವರಿಸೆ ಮತಿಪೋಪುದು ಮತಿಪೋಗಲದೆ ನಾಶ ವೀತರೆದಿ ಬಡೆತೊನವು ಆಪತ್ತುಗಳಿಗೆಲ್ಲ ಬೀಡಪ್ಪುದು. Now, this is readily understandable, intelligible to all of us. And what it does is, it does not sacrifice the poetic fragrance of the original, but at the same time, also manages to maintain intact the Shrinkhala Mula Alankara of the original. This is a remarkable achievement, the Karanamala Alankara. Then, to as a contrast, let us look at his rendering of a verse from the Kannada Kavya Prakash, from Mammata's Kavya Prakasha. This is an example of the Swabhavokti Alankara. Swabhavokti is, as Dr. Ganesh here calls it, a Vyakhya Alankara. It prides itself on being a very minute microscopic description of a very trivial or mundane affair. This verse talks about a horse that has just woken up and is stretching its legs and so on and wanting to graze. This verse is in the Sraddhara meter. Paschadangri prasaryatrika vinatam draghayitvangamuchaihi asajya bhugna kantho mukhamurasi satam dhuli dhumram vidhuya ghasagrasabhilashadanavarata chalat prothatundastu rango mandam shabdayamano vilikhati shayanadutthita kshmankurena. Krishnamurthy, because this verse appears on an academic treatise, he translates this in the Mahasraddhara meter, maintaining the Adiprasa. Bidusuttum purvapada dvaya manavanata skandhadin angamuddam nade kanal vage kantham mogamira ledayol kesaram dhuli dhumram naduguttum pare pullam meluva bayakiyim bayan alladi suttum nidudum kuguttamashvam barevudu gorasim bhumiyam nidrajaral. This is a remarkable rendering and brings to our mind the translations done by such traditional experts such as Basavappa Shastri, because it is very difficult to adopt Kannada words, native Kannada words, to render a Swabhavokti verse, because the gati of the Chandogati of Sraddhara is filled with Laghu syllables. It is Laghu Bahala. And Laghu and Guru both, but managing the string of Laghus that come in the middle is extraordinarily difficult, especially using Kannada words. Meluva, and it is similarly difficult in Sanskrit, but Krishnamurthy has not chosen or has not brought in the Kannada or the Sanskrit words as they are in the original, but has used very nice Kannada words. And another significant facet of Krishnamurthy's works is that he usually quotes verses that are rare and beautiful. And these verses reveal his wide reading and impeccable aesthetic taste. Hama Nayak, the well-known Kannada literator, has recorded a nice anecdote which I would like to share here. While Krishnamurthy was working on his translation of Bhamaha's Kavya Alankara, he was put up at Kumta. He had finished writing the introduction to this work, but was looking for a verse to conclude the essay. And when he went to college that day, it was raining, as is usual to that part of Karnataka. And because he walked to college, he was probably drenched. And no sooner had he reached the library than an old piece of paper that had fallen off from a book stuck to his wet shoes. Krishnamurthy picked it up, read it, and found the perfect verse that he was looking for. Kasyachideva kadachid dayaya vishayam saraswati vidushaha ghatayati kamapitamanyo vrajati jano yena vaidagdhim. Someone sometime endowed with Saraswati's grace understands a concept, understands a literary precept, realization dawns on him, and utilizing this knowledge, someone else becomes a scholar. And that Krishnamurthy found it apt to include this in his translation of Bhamaha's Kavya Alankara is very significant, because Bhama himself was such a scholar, was such a redoubtable scholar. He does not blindly subscribe to the precepts handed down from position, but takes very bold and original stands. In fact, he is the first person to inaugurate the study of Indian aesthetics after the time of Bharata. Kavya Alankara is the first work that that is available to us in this time. The works of Medhavirudra, etc., we do not have them. So Krishnamurthy believed that the sayings of past masters can supply strength to our own feeble words. A well-crafted words, Krishnamurthy thought, with a telling imagery, can easily accomplish what pages and pages of academic exposition cannot. He cites the verses of various poets and scholars, Ratnashri Jnana, Abhinavagupta, Bilhana, Mankha, Dhananjaya, Narendra Prabhasuri, Appaya Dikshita, Vedanta Deshika, Bhattoji Dikshita, Simha Bhupala, and even a contemporary scholar, Sri Krishna Brahmatantra Parakala Swami. Now, there is no time to quote any of the verses, so I will excuse myself from the very inviting opportunity of reading out those verses. And apart from them, he also quotes from epigraphs, unpublished manuscripts, and even works of various shastras. And he also wrote numerous original works in English. Among them, the following are the most significant: Dhvanyaloka and its Critics, which was his PhD thesis; Essays in Sanskrit Criticism; Studies in Indian Aesthetics and Criticism. He delivered these as lectures in the Mysore University. Some Thoughts on Indian Aesthetics and Literary Criticism. Sorry, he delivered this book as a lecture. The former was published by D.V.K. Murthy. And finally, Indian Literary Theories, a reappraisal. Krishnamurthy edited a few chapters of Bharata's seminal treatise, the Natya Shastra, published from the Gaikwad Oriental series in Baroda. He wrote monographs on Bana and Kalidasa for the Central Sahitya Academy, and these are translated into all the major Indian languages. And in the evening of his life, he worked on a critical inventory of Ramayana studies. And Krishnamurthy was never a mere theorist. He undertook practical criticism whenever the opportunity presented itself. He analyzed poetry in Sanskrit, Kannada, and English in the light of fundamental tenets of Sanskrit aesthetics such as rasa, dhvani, auchitya, and vakrokti. Now, as far as Sanskrit poetry is concerned, he wrote two wonderful academic articles, both on alankaras or figures of speech. One on the alankaras in Srimad Ramayana of Valmiki, and the other on figures of speech in Kumaradasa's Janaki Harana. So what Krishnamurthy managed to accomplish in the brief span of these two works is that he has completely exhausted all the turns of expression that the poet can possibly employ in a sublime epic like the Ramayana or an ornate epic like Janaki Harana of Kumaradasa. And his analysis of a famous verse in the Dhvanyaloka, Anuragavati Sandhya Divasas Tatpurassaraha, Aho Daivagatih Kidruk Tathapina Samagamaha. Anandavardhana quotes this as an illustration of Guni Bhuta Vyangya. Krishnamurthy's analysis of this, I must say, is a landmark in the history of Sanskrit practical criticism, because he has unraveled the Vishwarupa of Alankaras by identifying as many as 7 figures of sense, Arthalankaras, in this small Anushtup verse. Shlishtarupaka, Samasokti, Vishama, Visheshokti, Vibhavana, Akshepa, and Nidarshana. I say this not just to quote the names of Alankaras, because figures of speech are the tools that we have, are very well crafted tools that we have to analyze an independent standalone Sanskrit verse. No other tool of Sanskrit aesthetics comes to our help. And Krishnamurthy shows in a very logical and elaborate manner how each of this figure of speech develops from each other, how they are inter-involved and how they develop from one another. And I cannot quote more details about this because there is no time for it. And Krishnamurthy has also analyzed several poems in Kannada using Dhvani. In his first ever published work in Kannada, Anandavardhana's Kavi Mimamse, like I have already told, he has chosen apt examples for various types of poetic suggestion, for various types of Dhvani from ancient and modern Kannada works. This is also a great accomplishment. He has analyzed the vachanas of Basavanna using the tenets of Indian aesthetics. So Krishnamurthy utilized all his knowledge that he had carefully garnered over the years to apply them and to analyze the works of all authors. His articles on the figures of speech in Karnataka Bharata Katha Manjari of Kumaravyasa is unique, and its very title is indicative of Krishnamurthy's keen literary sensibility. He calls it Kumaravyasanalli Vidyaparinatara Alankara. Now, students of Kannada literature will immediately recognize the phrase Vidyaparinatara Alankara that appears in the very poem that the article sets out to analyze. He wrote a full-length book on the science of criticism in Kannada titled Kannadadalli Kavya Tattva, and he also edited Kaviraja Marga, which is a seminal work on poetics and grammar in Kannada. Krishnamurthy also studied some of English poems and works in the light of Indian aesthetics. He has analyzed a sonnet composed by Wilfred Owen, etc. And I would like to read out his analysis of Thomas Gray's famous poem, Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard. This is really fascinating. The poem goes thus. Full many a gem of purest ray serene, the dark and fathom caves of ocean bare. Full many a flower is born to blush unseen and waste its sweetness on the desert air. Krishnamurthy's analysis goes thus. A Sahridaya would at once feel the depth of pathos in the situation as presented by the poet. The country churchyard is an ideal vibhava or background for the rise of gloomy thoughts relating to death. He realizes, that is, the Sahridaya realizes, that the poet is imaginatively going over the varied precious potentialities that death might have nipped in the bud, and sees at once how the analogies cited add to the crystallization of the mood of sorrow. In other words, the Sahridaya would not hesitate to take it as a very telling example of Karuna Rasadhwani, with its beauty enhanced by the apt application of Alankara and characterized by the quality of sweetness and perspicuity in style. Krishnamurthy goes on to say, the poet's touch of originality is seen in inviting our sympathy towards the common run of mankind in lieu of the usual heroes of history, and suggesting that there might be persons in the countryside more intrinsically worth than some recipients of honor at court. Close quote. Krishnamurthy's writings also touch upon some important aspects of comparative aesthetics. He finds a parallel to Anandavardhana's explanation of three concepts, Swatasambhavi, Kavi Praudhokti and Kavi Nibaddha Praudhokti, in T.S. Eliot's famous essay, The Three Voices of Poetry. According to him, a poet predominantly employs Swatasambhavi in an epic, Kavi Praudhokti in a lyric, and Kavi Nibaddha Praudhokti in a drama, respectively. This is almost a one-to-one match, one-to-one function, to use mathematical parlance. And building on the findings of his predecessors, Krishnamurthy showed striking parallels between Indian concepts such as rasa and sadharanikarana to objective correlative, a concept that is popularized by T.S. Eliot. He explains that the Indian distinction between bhava and rasa bears a close resemblance to personal emotion and art emotion, as enunciated again by T.S. Eliot. And in his considered opinion, the concept of Anukirtana, as explained by Bharata and Abhinavagupta, is a better form of Aristotle's mimesis. Krishnamurthy made this observation when he was just a student, not even postgraduate student, I think. He wrote a brilliant essay in Sanskrit called Alankara Shastre Kavya Vaividhyavada Vimarshaha, and he dedicates an entire chapter in that work to take up a detailed analysis of Aristotle's views on poetry. And most significantly, Krishnamurthy sees an echo of Aristotle's conception of catharsis in a verse from Bhattatota's Kavya Kautuka, a unique work that is now available, unfortunately, only in fragments. So Bhattatauta has this famous verse, Yathadarshan malenaiva malame vopahanyate tatha ragava bodhena pashyatam shodhyate manaha. Krishnamurthy says, just as dust is used to clean up a rusty mirror, in the same manner, the mind of connoisseurs is purified of passion through passion itself. And Krishnamurthy is credited with preparing the critical edition of Dhvanyaloka, a text that marks the highest accomplishment of India in the field of aesthetics. Apart from writing numerous scholarly articles and clarifying various aspects connected with the text, he also wrote a textbook in Kannada that serves as a most reliable introduction to poetic suggestion. Krishnamurthy, in his thesis and also in various papers he wrote later in his life, conclusively established that Anandavardhana is the author of both the Karika and the Vritti portion of Dhvanyaloka. And in doing so, he had to take on the likes of P.V. Kane, S.K. Day, and S.P. Bhattacharya. And P.V. Kane, despite all his greatness, obstinately held on to his own opinion that Karika and Vritti portions of Dhvanyaloko were authored by multiple authors. The following were some Krishnamurthy's arguments. I'm quoting just a few. He has an entire chapter in his thesis. Jayanta Bhatta, a strong opponent of Dhvani, makes no difference between the Karika and Vritti portions. So if a strong and staunch opponent of Dhvani considers the work to be of a single author, and he hails from Kashmir, the same place of Anandavardhana, and he was also a close contemporary of Anandavardhana. So all these details made Krishnamurthy establish that if Jayanta Bhatta opines the Dhvanyaloka to be the work of a single author, it should be so. And in several places, especially in the fourth Udyota of Dhvanyaloka, we see that the Karika and Vritti portions are indefinitely broken up. And if the text were to be the composition of several authors, this would not have been possible. And most importantly, Krishnamurthy makes a very pointed observation. Illustrative examples are of supreme significance to literary theory. He says there can be a Sankhya Karika or even a Mandukya Karika without illustrative examples, but not a Dhvani Karika. He edited and published Kuntaka's Vakrokti Jivita, another important text in Indian aesthetics. Before he published his edition, the text was available only in parts. Sushil Kumar's day's edition was there, another edition was there, but none of it had presented the text in its entirety. Krishnamurthy explained that it is a companion volume to Dhvanyaloka, in the sense that Kuntaka describes the process of poetic composition from the perspective of the poet, while Anandavardhana does the same from the perspective of the connoisseur. So although Krishnamurthy worked on Dhvanyaloka all through his life, he did not fail to see the original contribution made by Kuntaka. He drew attention to the Vakrokti Jivita's contribution as a text that brings out literary criticism by enlisting various instances. One of his articles titled Kalidasa in the Eyes of Kuntaka is a major contribution to Vakrokti studies. And for the first time, Krishnamurthy drew the attention of the scholarly world to the pramanas or criteria in Indian aesthetics. What are pramanas and why are they important? Pramanas are the tools to validate our knowledge. They are the building blocks, they are the first principles of all scholarly treatises, of all scholarly endeavors. A pramana is what equips us to distinguish between what is worthy of notice and what is not. It is viveka in the highest sense. Pramana is what gives us, what equips us to generate sadasad viveka. What is true and what is false. What is correct and what is not. What is true and so many things like that. And that is why in all the Shastrakaras give the foremost importance to Pramana Shastra, to Pramanas. And Nyaya Shastra itself is called the Pramana Shastra in Pramana Shastra. And Krishnamurthy identified that Loka, Veda and Adhyatma, as explained by Bharata, Abhinav Gupta, and also followed closely by Mahima Bhatta in his Vyakti Viveka, are the three pramanas in Indian aesthetics. Respectively, they denote knowledge handed down through the tradition, the world around, and one's own personal experience, one's own objective experience. A correct understanding of these is central to art appreciation. In fact, the Nyaya Shastra describes pramanas as what delimits a particular thing. So how to know that our exposition is correct or not? We can know by placing our concepts or placing our understanding under a frame that is called as iti karana. Mitis samyak parichittis tadvatta hi pramatrita tadayoga vyavachedaf pramanyam gautame mate. And Krishnamurthy brings that concept to the analysis of pramanas in Indian aesthetics. And he established without doubt that Vishveshwara Pandita, Vishveshwara Dikshita, the author of Chamatkara Chandrika, is the first scholar to refer to the famous Upanishadic mantra Rasovai Saha in connection with aesthetic experience. So all the traditional Vedantic commentators take Rasovai Saha as a connotation of Brahman, but scholars usually hold that Jagannatha Pandita is the first person to refer to Rasavaisaha in the context of aesthetic experience. Krishnamurti goes a step further back and establishes that it was Vishweshwara Pandita much before Jagannatha to do this. And what is interesting is he writes about this when discussing the Vachanas of Basavanna in Kannada. So this is how Krishnamurti or scholars such as him utilize every possible opportunity to bring out newer and newer vistas of scholarship. And his monograph in Kannada, titled Srijanashilate Mattu Panditya, and several of his English articles illustrate how concepts such as genius and talent, imagination and erudition, inspiration and practice went hand in hand in India. And among other things, these essays include several savory verses selected with perfect aesthetic taste from a wide range of Sanskrit and Kannada works. Now, in the limited time available, I would like to discuss some extraordinary insights that Krishnamurti has given into various aspects of Indian aesthetics. In fact, his books are full of such unsleeping insights. The following are only a few examples or samples. Krishnamurti says, what is abhinaya in theatre is varnana in poetry. I'm not going to give a critique or an explanation of all these insights because the time does not permit me. And he gives us a wonderful perspective to look at standalone verses and the entire composition as a whole. Now, the onus lies on a traditional scholar of aesthetics to compartmentalize various tools that are available to us. For example, if a student reads through the texts of Alankara Shastra, he would perhaps not understand for himself what concept to use where. So it is really the responsibility of a scholar to point out the kind of water that a concept holds. For example, what is the kind of strengths that Alankara has, as different from rasa, or in a complementary fashion to rasa. Krishnamurti makes a very pointed observation. He says, concepts such as Alankara, Guna and Riti are helpful in the appreciation of standalone verses, muktakas or even small segments of poetry. Whereas rasa and dhvani are concepts that aid in the analysis of whole works, such as poems, plays and epics. ಕನ್ನಡದಲ್ಲಿ ಅವರು ಹೇಳ್ತಾರೆ, ಕಾವ್ಯವನ್ನು ಬಿಡಿಯಾಗಿ ವಿಮರ್ಶಿಸುವಾಗ ಗುಣರೀತಿ ಅಲಂಕಾರಗಳು ಉಪಯೋಗವಾಗ್ತವೆ, ಕಾವ್ಯವನ್ನು ಇಡಿಯಾಗಿ ವಿಮರ್ಶಿಸುವಾಗ ರಸಧ್ವನಿ ಸಿದ್ಧಾಂತ ಉಪಯುಕ್ತವಾಗುತ್ತೆ ಅಂತ. This is a very fundamental truth about poetics. And he also draws our attention and he asks us to guard ourselves against mistaking poetic suggestion for prahelikas or a riddle. He says prahelika often masquerades as vastudhvani. We should take care to see it for what it actually is. If we are able to easily imagine the idea suggested by the verse, that is the vastu, then it is an illustration of vastudhvani. If we experience any sort of difficulty, then it is an illustration of prahelika. And he says something very nice about the definition of poetry, because almost all the treatises of Indian aesthetics and almost all modern compositions also begin or invariably include a definition of poetry. Look at what Krishnamurti says. It is in the very nature of poetry that it eludes an overall definition, though one cannot fail to recognize it when one finds it. Krishnamurti draws our attention to the organic nature of poetic appreciation. And I would like to quote Krishnamurti's own definition of poetry. Pratibha bhavita shesha varnana nipunah kavihi tasya karma bhavet kavyam rasabhava nirantaram. He gives this definition in his Sanskrit essay Kavya Alankara Shastre Kavya Vaividhyavada Vimarshaha. This definition is a very good definition because it talks about pratibha, which is central to the poetic process. It includes the aspect of varnana, which is again definitive, and also connects with the concept of itivritta as well. So it is not just varnana, it is also itivritta, because Krishnamurti talks about rasabhava nirantara. The rasabhava nirantaratva or the Rasabhava Nairantarya is seen explicitly in epics or in Itivrittas. That is why he takes care of all the poetic concepts. And he also has some unique things to say. On Bharata's repeated use of bhava in his paribhashika shabdas such as vibhava, anubhava, vyabhichari bhava, etc., one would naturally get the question, why has Bharata repeatedly used the word bhava? Krishnamurthy says, it should be noted that Bharata has coined all these technical terms retaining the core term bhava to emphasize the role of imagination on the part of the spectator. This is a wonderful observation. And he also makes a very pointed comment that on prasada guna. So what usually happens is almost all our aestheticians speak of the prasada guna as the greatest hallmark of poetry. Prasada guna, because it is the underlying feature of both madhurya and ojas, two other fundamental gunas. What is so much important, or why is the importance adduced to prasada guna appropriate? Krishnamurthy says that it is not just the lucidity of words or the lucidity of alankaras or language that a poet uses that is of significance to us, but rather it is the lucidity with which he is able to communicate his feelings to the connoisseurs, his feelings to the spectators. That is why perspicuity or prasadatva is held as a poetic guna, and its counterpart, aprasadatva, is a poetic blemish. Klishtatva, duruhatva, neyatva, etc. are all poetic blemishes because of this fundamental reason. Because rasa, as we all know, can only be suggested. It is vyangya and never be vachya. So in order to achieve that suggestion, in order to get that required momentum, to equip the readers with it in order to imagine the emotional ambience of a poem, the poet should have very transparent feelings, and the transparency or lucidity is really the essence of prasada guna. And Krishnamurthy also has something interesting to say on the poet's experience of rasa, because Abhinavagupta and his Abhivyaktivada, etc., hold the Sahridaya to be the locus of the aesthetic experience. What about the poet then? Poet is the one who gives us the poetry. And if he is devoid of rasa, then what motivates him to take up the creation of poetry? Krishnamurthy says, rasa is nothing but aesthetic joy. Hence the creative poet must perforce be credited with it. He says, if a pot is not full, it cannot overflow. Yavat purno na chaitena tavannaiva vamatyamum. In this sense, the creative urge or inspiration itself can be regarded as rasa. The poet himself might appreciate his own work at a later stage after creating it. This is also rasa, but in another sense. So this aspect is not touched upon by any of our ancient writers in Sanskrit aesthetics. Of course, some writers, some later day writers, even Ruyaka in his Alankara Sarvasva and some other writers take up this issue, but Krishnamurthy's observations are very original. And he has something again remarkable to say. He draws a parallel between Panini and medieval Sanskrit poets. He says something very unique. What Panini did was to give a very structured edifice for the Sanskrit language, and because of the structure provided by Panini, Sanskrit language also became arrested. Krishnamurthy says, if the grammar arrested the natural growth of the language, it also saved it from linguistic decay. So much so that in respect of clarity, after even a lapse of 2000 years, the Sanskrit language remains unique and unparalleled. And he makes a distinction and draws a parallel to medieval Sanskrit poets. He says, if Sanskrit poets failed to add new dimensions to their art, they uniquely succeeded in perfecting the poetic technique to its highest watermark in the whole history of world poetry. And regarding the meanings of two fundamental words, Shabda and Artha, Krishnamurthy repeatedly asks us to understand them as the form and content of poetry and not just as word and meaning. He says, All the elements of the poetic art directed to please the ear come under Shabda, while Artha embrace what we call the poetic theme or subject. The fusion of the two was the poetic process. And regarding Dhwani, to the exposition of which Krishnamurti dedicated his entire life, there are some very salient observations. He says that the raging controversy that was created by the opponents of Dhwani was so all-pervasive that it prevented even a staunch supporter of the Dhwani theory such as Mammata to leave out the very word Dhwani from his definition of poetry. So, Tadadosho Shabdartho Saguna Analankriti Punah Kwapi etc. Mammata's definition of poetry does not include the word Dhwani. Now, after reading Krishnamurti's observation, we say, ಇಷ್ಟು ಸಹಜ ಅಲ್ವಾ ಅಂತ ಅನ್ಸುತ್ತೆ. ಕೃಷ್ಣಮೂರ್ತಿ ಅವರು ಬರೆಯೋದಕ್ಕೆ ಮುನ್ನ ನಮಗೆ ಹೀಗೆ ತೋರೋದಿಲ್ಲ. ಸೊ ದಟ್ ಈಸ್ Krishnamurti's unique insight into the subject. And he also makes one another observation that in the whole range of Sanskrit poetics, apart from Dhvanyaloka, there is no other texts that treats the theory of Dhvani exclusively. So Krishnamurti says, while Dhvanyaloka was such an original work, it caused so many problems to its opponents and also its supporters in establishing the theory that it became a contraceptive to itself. There was no other work that treated with Dhvani exclusively. And his observations on the decadence in Sanskrit poetry is remarkable for both the content and the language in which it is expressed. Krishnamurti says, and I quote it because his words are very juicy, "All the works written in this age of decadent taste may be said to be the coins of the same mold, since we find everywhere the same literary flourishes and consummate conceits. The difference can be discerned only in the theme, which serves no better purpose than a peg on which to hang their artificial display. These writers handle their materials as if with a gloved hand. They were the victims of a convention, Kavi Samaya, that sought in language a gaudy substitute for the thing instead of its close-fitting garment. And in the realm of pure poetry, where we look for lofty thought and vivid imagination, they were denied open vision and free-soaring flights. They sang in a cage and not upon a branch. Though they wield language with such astonishing skill, they seldom work the miracles with it that proclaim the divine poet." And look at what he says, what he reserves for the end. "The most brilliant electric light is not sunshine." And speaking on Natya Shastra, like I said, he edited the first 6 or 7 chapters of the Natya Shastra. He makes a very good observation on the need for interdisciplinary study in solving the textual problems connected with the Natya Shastra. A clear picture can only emerge when only specialists in the disciplines of Sangeeta Shastra, Abhinaya schools, and the ancient Indian stage sit together and sort out things in the light of the vast material available under each head in the different disciplines. This problem, I am afraid, cannot be tackled by Sanskrit scholars alone, unassisted by interdisciplinary specialists. And even to this day, the problem persists, whereas Krishnamurti has shown the way forward. Now, before concluding, I would like to make a few observations that Krishnamurti makes. At times, he gets carried away by quote-unquote academic zeal and makes some unsound pronouncements. For instance, he offers a high mantle to every scholars on whom he chooses to write, regardless of their intrinsic worth. For instance, while writing on Bhamaha, he says Bhama himself is the foremost aesthetician. He tries to disprove that ancient aestheticians such as Bhamaha and Dandi, he tries to prove, not disprove, they knew the concepts of rasa and dhvani. This is manifestly incorrect. We need not deny them a feel for rasa and dhvani, but crediting them with the logical formulation of these theories would be erroneous. Krishnamurti also tries to confer upon Udbhata, Vamana, etc. a high status that they do not deserve. In some places, he makes entirely absurd statements. He says, the existence of Vidushaka or the court fool in the earliest dramas indicates that the drama was mainly meant for the princely education and entertainment and a select audience of critics trained in the rules of Bharata. And this next statement is really ridiculous. The Sanskrit stage was never popular, and we are unaware of any commercial theatre which ever put up a drama of Sanskrit on the boards. Now, for readers of the Ramayana, starting from the Ramayana to works like Kuttinimata and even Alankara Shastra works, and most importantly, Krishnamurthy's own mentor A.R. Krishna Shastri, in his work Samskrita Nataka, has given some evidence to prove that Sanskrit drama was popular. And this is not a matter for scholars to shake their heads in disappointment. This is a matter of popular knowledge, of community consciousness, of all of us know it. There is, of course, many evidences available to debunk this pronouncement, but I shall not go into any of it. His criticism at times of contemporary scholars such as V. Raghavan, N. Ranganatha Sharma and T. N. Srikantaya, I must confess, is driven more by personal bias than commitment to truth. And most importantly, some of his views on rasa, specifically expressed in his monograph Rasollasa, and some of his English articles such as Rasa as a canon of literary criticism and the riddle of rasa in Sanskrit poetics, are extremely unsound. In Rasollasa, he expresses dissatisfaction with Abhinavagupta's explanation of rasa, but does not propose a meaningful alternative to it. He posits that the rasa of plays is different from the rasa of poems, and holds that the aesthetic experience lies in the protagonist and not the connoisseur. And he also tried to arrive at the original intention of Bharata regarding rasa, untainted by the views of Anandavardhana and Abhinavagupta. This is really fallacious, and it is like trying to understand Panini without the aid of Katyayana and Patanjali, Vamana and Jayaditya. We cannot do it. So, as a general observation, I would like to humbly submit that a beginner or a student of Sanskrit literature will do well to begin the study of Krishnamurthy's works from two of his Kannada works. One is Samskrita Kavya and the other is Bharatiya Kavya Mimamse Tattva Mattu Prayoga. The former presents Sanskrit poetry in all its richness and gives the lakshya of the subject, and the latter introduces sound aesthetic principles essential to analyze all kinds of poetry, that is the lakshana part of it. Now, be that as it may, when a scholar writes so prolifically, some lapses are bound to occur in the writings of any scholar for that matter. But like Dr. Ganesh said about Professor S.K. Ramachandra Rao quoting Kalidasa, Eko hi dosho gunasannipate nimajjati indoh kiraneshvivankaha. Krishnamurthy's writings offer us remarkable insights and details about aesthetics, and the lapses are minor and insignificant. And some takeaways from Krishnamurthy's works. He had a remarkable mastery, like I said, over Sanskrit, English and Kannada, and he never took any of this language for granted. What usually happens is, because Kannada happens to be our mother tongue, we do not usually make an attempt to read Kannada works, to develop scholarship in Kannada. Krishnamurthy did not do that. He read widely in all these languages and never took them for granted. Especially traditional Sanskrit scholars turn a blind eye to Kannada, and they are extremely diffident about their lack of knowledge in English. Of course, they lack opportunities also, but Krishnamurthy himself was the product of poverty and so many ailments, like I said. He had even physical ailments, but by the sheer dint of hard work, he gathered the mastery of all these subjects. Now, this blend of languages is a model for all times, because Sanskrit grants us access to our hoary past and forms the foundation for all studies related to India, whereas regional languages, especially Kannada, etc., helps one stay rooted and see interconnections between seemingly unrelated concepts. And the study of English opens up new vistas of knowledge and offers a much needed historical perspective. And Krishnamurthy, his works rather eloquently attest the fact that a sensitive scholar's constant contemplation on a subject generates amazing insights into it. They inspire us to develop a wide and deep perspective, not just on Alankara Shastra, but on any subject that we choose to study. Krishnamurthy's own works, though he wrote mainly on Alankara Shastra, he quotes from a wealth of primary sources in Sanskrit, Vedas, Nirukta, Vishnu Purana, Bhagavata, and Mimamsa works, Shabara Bhashya, Shloka Vartika, Tantra Vartika, etc., Nyaya works, Atma Tattva Viveka, Nyaya Manjari, Khandana Khandakadya, and work of Advaita Vedanta, Yoga Sutras, Viveka Chudamani, Mahartha Manjari of Pratyabhijna Shaiva Darshana, Tantra Loka again, and Artha Shastra, Kama Shastra, etc. So, one should have a thorough knowledge of all these subjects if we have to consider him as a scholar. And as far as the study of Indian aesthetics is concerned, Krishnamurthy inspires us to adopt an integrated approach. I would like to conclude from a quote from his own writing. Krishnamurthy says, "The whole procedure of treating Indian poetics under so many schools or prasthanas, the Alankara Prasthana, Guna, Riti, Rasa, Dhvani, Vakrokti, etc., is a misconception, not borne out by facts. And the sooner it is abandoned, it is the better for clarity. The mansion of beauty has many halls, and all of them together constitute the whole. To dissect each part without reference to the whole is neither good precept nor good criticism." Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot for the excellent exposition, Shashi Kiran. It was a wonderful journey into the life and works of Dr. K. Krishnamoorthy. Shashi Kiran's very thorough reading of the original Sanskrit texts, be it the Lakshya Granthas or the Lakshana Granthas, Kavya and Alankara Shastra Granthas, and also the works of K. Krishnamoorthy was very well evidenced in his talk. So wonderful. Thanks a lot on the behalf of the Gokhale Institute of Public Affairs and the Preksha Pratishtana. It would only be befitting if Shatabdani Dr. R. Ganesh comes to felicitate Shashi Kiran BN. Dr. Ganesh is an embodiment of Alankara Shastra who is amongst us. So please.
Thank you. It's often said in our tradition that if a person having imbibed knowledge is not going to offer to others, he will become Brahma Rakshasa. In that sense, whatever little I could gain from masters like Kiran, Kane and others in their absence through their books and in person and also through works from people like K. Krishnamoorthy and others, Dr. N. Ranganath Sharma and others, that little I used to share with my friends, and it is such a gratifying thing that that little knowledge, whatever I could gain and share as a part of enjoyment and informal interaction, that has manifested so profoundly and seriously rich and enriching as well. That's why I thank my destiny for that, more than thanking and commending people like Shashi Kiran and my friend Sandeep, Balakrishna and others who spoke on this dais in this series. I personally thank Shashi for this wonderful exposition. I have so many personal anecdotes and interactions with K. Krishnamoorthy, only to support what all Shashi Kiran said. He used to be very sincere and very prompt in replying, very beautiful handwriting, and also very warm in appreciation. Direct students of him, though I was an Ekalavya Shishya, no thumb of mine was cut by Krishnamurthy. Rather, he empowered me, he armed me, he gave Chaturbhuja to me in that sense. Many of his direct students used to complain that Krishnamurthy was ruthless and he was not gracious at times. But not an iota of that was felt personally by me. It's my good fortune. And always he encouraged me to write. and even to study various things. And he was very eager to clear any of my doubts. And many times I used to question him regarding the disputable work Rasollasa. I had questioned. And he debated for a while and told, this much we could do. You continue and do it better. And here something is better. Thank you.
Thanks a lot to our live viewers and the online viewers. We'll request everybody who's present here to join us for lunch. Tomorrow will be the last day of this series of exemplars of Indian wisdom from Karnataka. We'll have sessions by Dr. Ganesh. Both the first half and the second half will be handled by Shatabdani Dr. R. Ganesh. Requesting everybody's participation tomorrow also. Namaste.